Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Sleepless Dossier, the only place where history keeps you up at night. Today, we're pulling the curtain back on the first critical hours of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. We're not just talking about an earthquake or a tsunami. We're talking about what really happened behind the scenes, the buried warnings, the deliberate delays and the lies told to a nation and the world, while 3 nuclear reactors melted down. This isn't a story about a natural disaster. It's a clinical examination of institutional decay, a deep dive into a catastrophe that was not only predictable, but in fact, was predicted. Before we dive into the inevitable betrayals and cascading failures, if you appreciate us digging up the facts that keep regulators and executives awake, please hit that like and subscribe. It ensures these secrets keep finding their way into the light. Alright, dim the lights, this one gets messy. To understand the meltdown of March 2011, you have to first understand the myth. In Japan, it had a name: Anzin Shinwa, the safety myth. This wasn't just a corporate slogan or a public relations campaign. It was a quasi-religious article of faith, a foundational pillar of the nation's post-war identity. After the humiliation of World War II, Japan rebuilt itself into an economic and technological titan. Its cars were more reliable, its electronics more precise, and its bullet trains were the envy of the world. And the ultimate symbol of this technological supremacy was its nuclear power program. It was clean, it was efficient, and above all, it was presented as absolutely, unconditionally safe. Nuclear accidents were things that happened elsewhere, in the chaotic Soviet Union with its shoddy workmanship at Chernobyl, or in the complacent United States at 3 Mile Island. In Japan, where precision and discipline were cultural imperatives, such a failure was considered a conceptual impossibility. This myth was nurtured by a powerful and insular coalition of electric power companies, government ministries like the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI, and compliant academics. They formed what was known as the nuclear village, an ecosystem where dissent was professionally ruinous, and skepticism was treated as a form of national betrayal. School textbooks depicted smiling, cartoon atoms powering happy cities. Public information campaigns assured citizens that the plants were robust enough to withstand anything nature could throw at them. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, operated by the Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, was a jewel in this crown. Its 6 boiling water reactors perched on the coast of Okuma were monuments to this unwavering belief in technological infallibility. But they were monuments built on a lie. They were fortresses built on geologically unstable sand. The Japanese archipelago is a violent place. It sits at the conjunction of 4 major tectonic plates, a permanent resident of the Pacific Ring of Fire, the most seismically and volcanically active zone on the planet. Earthquakes and the tsunamis they generate are not black swan events. They are a fundamental, recurring feature of the nation's history. And the very men who signed off on the construction and safety protocols for Fukushima Daiichi knew this. The problem was that the truth was inconvenient, and more importantly, it was expensive. The original design specifications for the plant's seawall called for it to withstand a tsunami of approximately 5.7 meters. This number wasn't pulled from thin air. It was the product of carefully selected, deeply conservative historical models that conveniently omitted the most catastrophic precedents. It was a number designed to be achievable, not to be safe. For years, voices from the fringes of the scientific community had been warning them. Paleoseismologists pointed to evidence of the Jogan tsunami of 869 AD, a monster wave that had left sand deposits miles inland along the very same coastline where Fukushima stood. The geological scars on the landscape told a clear story. This region was capable of producing tsunamis far greater than TEPCO's defenses could ever handle. These warnings were not secrets whispered in darkened rooms. They were published in peer-reviewed journals. Yet within the nuclear village, they were dismissed. Admitting that the historical record predicted a wave of 10, 15, or even 20 meters would have meant admitting that the fundamental designs of multiple reactors were fatally flawed. It would have triggered retrofitting requirements costing billions upon billions of yen, and would have shattered the precious Anzin Shinwa. Here we find our first uncomfortable truth. a sentiment captured in what might as well have been a classified internal memo circulating within the industry. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a senior TEPCO risk analyst speaking off the record in 2007, "We do not model for possibilities that invalidate the business model. Our job is to prove the existing infrastructure is safe based on the accepted data, not to search for data that proves it is unsafe. The regulators understand this. It is a game of shared reassurance." And there it is. The game. It wasn't about science or safety. It was about mutually reinforcing a profitable narrative. The regulators needed the industry to power the economy, and the industry needed the regulators to provide the stamp of public legitimacy. They weren't protecting the public. They were protecting each other. They were protecting the myth. This is the essential meta-commentary on the entire disaster. The failure at Fukushima didn't begin at 2:46 p.m. on March 11, 2011. It was set in motion decades before, in boardrooms where financial reports were valued more than geological reports, in government offices where political stability was prioritized over public safety, and in a national psyche that had been coaxed into believing that their technological prowess could somehow conquer the raw, indifferent power of the planet. They built a cathedral to their own ingenuity on a fault line and filled it with the most dangerous materials known to man. They weren't just tempting fate, they were issuing a formal, engraved invitation to catastrophe. And the RSVP was about to arrive with the force of 9.1 megatons. That game of shared reassurance was more insidious than a simple gentleman's agreement to ignore inconvenient science from the outside. The most damning evidence, the single most unforgivable piece of foresight, didn't come from a rogue academic or a worried geologist. It came from inside the fortress itself. It came from TEPCO's own computers. In 2008, 3 years before the black wave would scour the coast, TEPCO was in possession of a digital ghost of Fukushima's future. Following a 2007 earthquake that damaged their Kashiwazaki-Kariwa nuclear plant, the world's largest, regulators and the public were getting nervous. The Anzen Shinwa was showing cracks. Under pressure, TEPCO grudgingly agreed to re-evaluate the tsunami threat to its other facilities, including Fukushima Daiichi. This wasn't an act of genuine due diligence. It was a performative gesture to placate their overseers. They tasked a subsidiary with running a new set of simulations. This time, however, they couldn't just use the old, comfortable data. Seismic science had moved on. The evidence for massive, ancient tsunamis like the 869 Jogan event was becoming too overwhelming to simply ignore. So, they fed this new, more threatening data into their models. They asked the machine a question they clearly hoped would yield the same old reassuring answer. The machine did not oblige. The results that came back were not a warning. They were a death sentence for the plant as it was currently configured. The simulation predicted that a major earthquake off the coast of Fukushima could generate a tsunami with a maximum height of 15.7 meters. Let's be perfectly clear about what that number means. The seawall at Fukushima Daiichi was designed to withstand a wave of 5.7 meters. The ground on which the reactor buildings and, critically, the turbine buildings sat was about 10 meters above sea level. A 15.7-meter wave wouldn't just breach the seawall. It would cascade over it like a waterfall, turning the entire plant site into a turbulent, shallow sea. It would inundate everything. And everything included the plant's last line of defense against a total catastrophe, the emergency diesel generators. These generators, essential for powering the cooling systems in the event of a grid failure, were located in the unprotected, unwaterproofed basements of the turbine buildings. A 15.7-meter wave meant they would be submerged in salt water within minutes. It meant a guaranteed station blackout. It meant a guaranteed triple meltdown. TEPCO knew this. In 2008, they had a detailed, computer-generated preview of the exact mechanism of failure that would occur in March 2011. The discovery should have triggered alarm bells at the highest levels of government and industry. It should have prompted immediate, sweeping, and astronomically expensive upgrades. The seawall needed to be tripled in height. The generators needed to be moved to hardened, watertight bunkers on higher ground. The entire safety philosophy of the plant was now proven to be a fiction. But that isn't what happened. The report was passed up the chain of command, from the engineers who ran the numbers to the mid-level managers, and finally to the senior executives at TEPCO headquarters in Tokyo. And there, in the sterile quiet of a corporate boardroom, the data died. It wasn't a matter of scientific debate. It was a matter of cost-benefit analysis where the cost was a certainty, billions of yen, and the benefit was preventing a disaster that had a low, but non-zero probability of occurring. The fortress, it turned out, was made of concrete and steel, but its safety guarantees were made of paper. This is where the true calculated negligence takes center stage. This wasn't ignorance. It was a conscious decision to suppress inconvenient data. It was an executive choice to gamble with public safety to protect the bottom line. The logic is as chilling as it is simple, and it's best captured in the kind of language corporations use when they decide that human lives are a manageable externality. Classified memo. Subject: Tsunami countermeasure. Re-evaluation. F. Daiichi. Date: October 2008. From Vice President, Nuclear Asset Management. To General Manager, Plant Siting Division. The results of the recent Jogen model simulation are noted. While the probabilistic modeling is robust, the findings are a significant deviation from established government standards and historical precedent. Initiating immediate large-scale civil engineering works based on this single simulation would have an unjustifiable impact on our operational budget and could create undue public anxiety. We will categorize this as a matter for long-term academic research and further study. Do not forward these findings to NISA, the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, until we have a consensus on a more moderate, phased approach to potential countermeasures. Undue public anxiety, unjustifiable impact on our operational budget, long-term academic research. This is the language of burial. It is the bureaucratic vocabulary of active, willful blindness. They took the blueprint for the apocalypse, stamped it, pending further study, and filed it away in a cabinet where it could do no financial harm. They chose the balance sheet over the seawall, and this single, deliberate act of concealment is the linchpin of the entire disaster. The meta-commentary here is brutal. The Fukushima catastrophe was not an act of God. It was an act of accounting. Every decision that followed the earthquake, the panicked attempts to find power, the desperate battle to cool the reactors, the eventual explosions and radioactive releases, was a direct, foreseeable consequence of this one decision made in 2008. They had a clear, unambiguous warning from their own engineers, and they smothered it with corporate procedure and financial prudence. They looked at the abyss, calculated the cost of building a bridge, and decided it was cheaper to risk falling in. 3 years later, the bill for that decision came due, and it was paid not by the executives in their Tokyo offices, but by the hundreds of thousands of people whose lives would be irrevocably shattered. At 2:46 p.m. on Friday, March 11, 2011, the earth beneath the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant began to tear itself apart. This was not a tremor, it was a convulsion. The Great Tohoku earthquake was a magnitude 9.1 megathrust event, one of the 5 most powerful earthquakes ever recorded by humanity. It unleashed energy equivalent to over 600 million Hiroshima bombs. For 6 minutes, the ground bucked and roared. At the plant site, the shaking violently exceeded the facility's design basis, the maximum seismic stress its engineers had ever planned for it to survive. The official design basis for the oldest reactor, Unit 1, was a ground acceleration of 0.448 g force. On that day, it was hit with 0.56 g. The plant was being subjected to forces it was never, ever meant to withstand. As designed, the seismic sensors immediately triggered a scram, an emergency shutdown. Control rods shot into the cores of the 3 active reactors, Units 1, 2, and 3, halting the nuclear fission chain reaction. This is the first critical moment where the public narrative and the physical reality begin to diverge. Halting fission does not mean the danger is over. A reactor core, even after shutdown, remains phenomenally hot due to the decay of radioactive isotopes. It's like turning off a gas burner under a pot of water. The flame is gone, but the metal remains scalding and will boil the water for a long time. This decay heat requires a constant, massive flow of cooling water, or the core will rapidly overheat and melt. This is non-negotiable nuclear physics. The earthquake instantly severed the plant's connection to the external power grid. The massive transmission towers crumpled, cutting the main lifeline for the cooling pumps. As per procedure, the backup system kicked in. 13 emergency diesel generators, located in the basements of the turbine buildings, roared to life. For a few precious minutes, it seemed like the myth was holding. The ground had delivered an impossible blow, yet the automated safety systems had performed. TEPCO's first reports to the government and its initial public statements were calm, measured, and catastrophically misleading. They reported a successful shutdown. They reported that the cooling systems were operating on emergency power. They painted a picture of a facility that had weathered the storm, a testament to the robustness of Japanese engineering. This was the first official lie. The truth, pieced together later from scattered instrument readings and reluctant worker testimony, was far darker. The plant was not stable. It was already breaking. The violent, prolonged shaking had likely inflicted severe damage on the circulatory system of the reactors. Across the facility, a complex web of pipes, welds, and valves was stressed to its breaking point. There is compelling evidence, particularly at Unit 1, that the earthquake itself caused a small break, loss of coolant accident, or LOCA. Critical piping may have cracked or ruptured, causing the reactor to begin losing its precious cooling water long before the tsunami made landfall. The patient wasn't stable and waiting for the next blow. It was already bleeding internally. The corporate reflex, ingrained by decades of prioritizing image over reality, took over. Control the narrative. Project Calm. Adhere to the script of the Anzen Shinhwa. Any admission of earthquake damage would have been an admission that the plant's fundamental design was flawed, a confession of the very inadequacy they had spent billions to deny. Classified memo, initial plant status report, internal. Time, 15:05 JST. From, Fukushima Daiichi Shift Supervisor, to, TEPCO Nuclear Operations Center, Tokyo. Subject, post-scram status. All active units successfully scrammed following major seismic event. Off-site power is lost. All emergency diesel generators are operational and powering essential cooling systems. We have some anomalous pressure readings in the Unit 1 torus and reports of minor damage to non-essential structures. Situation is considered stable and under control per EOP-1, Emergency Operating Procedure 1, proceeding with standard cold shutdown protocols. Anomalous pressure readings, minor damage, stable and under control. This is the language of catastrophic self-deception. There is no such thing as a minor problem in a nuclear reactor that has just sustained beyond design basis shaking and lost its primary power source. Every anomaly is a potential prelude to disaster. By framing the situation within the comforting confines of standard protocols, they were lying not just to the government, but to themselves. They were trying to force an unprecedented event into a pre-written, manageable script. This is the meta-commentary on those first critical 50 minutes. The initial lie wasn't just a PR blunder. It was a tactical error of historic proportions. It squandered the only window of opportunity they had. If TEPCO had immediately reported that the plant was severely damaged by the quake and potentially losing coolant, the nature of the national emergency response would have been entirely different. But they didn't. They said everything was fine. And so, while the operators at the plant were wrestling with a machine that was already starting to fail, the officials in Tokyo believed they had time. They were operating on a false premise, a fiction crafted by a corporate culture deathly afraid of admitting its own vulnerability. The fortress had held, they were told, but the walls were already cracked from the inside, and 50 minutes after the shaking started, the real monster, the one they had simulated and then ignored, was just cresting the horizon. The lie of stability hung in the air for exactly 55 minutes. 55 minutes of false reassurance, of anomalous readings and standard protocols. And then, the sea delivered its verdict. It arrived not as a cresting wave, but as a silent, mountainous wall of dark water, a moving cliff that had scoured the land clean for miles and was now coming to claim the fortress. The 15.7-meter tsunami that TEPCO's own computers had predicted in 2008, the one they had categorized as a matter for long-term academic research, slammed into Fukushima Daiichi. It didn't just breach the pathetic 5.7-meter seawall, it erased it from existence. The water cascaded over the 10-meter-high bluff upon which the reactor sat, a churning, debris-filled torrent that instantly submerged the lower levels of the plant. This was the moment the game of shared reassurance ended, and the laws of physics took brutal, absolute control. The water flooded into the turbine buildings, the UN-hardened, unprotected structures sitting closest to the sea, and in their basements sat the heart of the plant's emergency response, the diesel generators. The salt water inundated them in seconds. They sputtered, choked, and died. At the same time, the floodwaters destroyed the seawater pumps needed for an alternative form of cooling. But the killing blow was dealt to the electrical switchgear, the nerve centers that distributed power throughout the site. They too were located in low-lying, unwaterproofed areas. The saltwater created massive short circuits, and in an instant, the entire facility was plunged into a profound and terrifying darkness. In the central control room for Units 1 and 2, the world simply ceased to exist. One moment, the operators were looking at hundreds of data points on brightly lit panels, monitoring pressures and water levels. The next, every screen went black. Every light went out. The reassuring hum of machinery was replaced by a deafening silence, punctuated only by the distant, horrifying roar of the sea and the sudden, panicked shouts of men who had just become the blind custodians of 3 melting nuclear cores. This was it. The station blackout. The SBO. In the lexicon of nuclear engineering, it is the ultimate nightmare, the absolute worst-case scenario. It is a condition where a nuclear plant is cut off from all alternating current, AC power, both from the external grid and from its own on-site emergency generators. Without AC power, the massive pumps that force cooling water into the reactor pressure vessels cannot function. The plant is left with only a handful of emergency DC batteries which can power a few critical gauges and valves for a matter of hours, but are utterly incapable of stopping the thermal runaway that was now beginning in the cores. This scenario, the total loss of all AC power from a single external event, was considered so remote by TEPCO and the Japanese regulators that it was effectively treated as an impossibility. Their planning documents, their safety cases, their entire emergency response architecture was built on the assumption that it would never, ever happen. They planned for the loss of the grid. They planned for the failure of 1 or 2 diesel generators. But the idea that a single wave could wipe out all 13 generators and all the switchgear simultaneously was dismissed as an event with a probability too low to warrant serious consideration or costly preventative measures. Their hubris was codified into their safety regulations. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a 2006 NISA, Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, review of plant safety protocols. The risk of a prolonged station blackout event initiated by a seismic tsunami sequence is deemed to be acceptably low. The redundancy of multiple physically separated diesel generators, in conjunction with robust grid connections, provides sufficient defense in depth against such a contingency. No further retrofitting to protect against beyond design basis inundation is required at this time. Acceptably low. Sufficient defense in depth. This is the clinical language of a catastrophic failure of imagination. They looked at a nuclear plant built on the shore of the most tsunami-prone nation on Earth and concluded that protecting its emergency power sources from water was a priority. They built a lifeboat with holes in it because they never truly believed the ship would sink. And here lies the devastating meta-commentary on this moment. The blackout was not a surprise. It was an inevitability born from denial. The operators in that dark control room were not just victims of a tsunami. They were the inheritors of decades of institutional arrogance. They were handed emergency manuals that, in the absence of electricity, had just become useless bundles of paper. They were tasked with following procedures that began with the instruction restore power, an instruction that was now a cruel joke. The darkness that enveloped the control room was a perfect metaphor for the corporate and regulatory culture that had allowed this to happen. A complete and willful blindness to the obvious, predictable reality of the risks they were managing. They were no longer in control of a power plant. They were trapped inside 3 ticking time bombs, and the clocks were running on battery power. In the suffocating blackness of the control room, the operators of Fukushima Daiichi were confronted with a truth more terrifying than the earthquake or the tsunami. They had been abandoned by their own creators. Their training, their careers, their entire professional existence was based on interpreting data from a sophisticated electronic nervous system that had just been decapitated. Now, stumbling by the weak scattered beams of emergency flashlights, they were no longer engineers. They were men trapped in a tomb, desperately trying to read the hieroglyphs on the wall. The first instinct, drilled into them by years of repetition, was to consult the scripture, the emergency operating procedures. These were not pamphlets, they were enormous multi-volume binders, meticulously tabbed and cross-referenced, the product of thousands of hours of safety analysis and procedural planning. They were the corporate brain, the codified wisdom that was supposed to guide them through any conceivable crisis. A worker pulled a binder from its shelf, the plastic cover slick in the humid, stagnant air. He flipped it open. And there, the true, farcical nature of their predicament revealed itself in cold, sterile print. The procedures were a script for a world that no longer existed. Step 1 of a typical emergency manual would read, "Confirm reactor water level on the main control panel." The panel was a sheet of dead black glass. Step 2. Activate the residual heat removal system, Pump B. The switch for Pump B did nothing. It was a dead toggle connected to a dead circuit. The manuals were an endless looping litany of actions that required electricity. They instructed the operators to monitor gauges that were inert, to open valves that were electronically actuated, to start pumps that had no power. Every page was a testament to the colossal, foundational failure of imagination by the men who wrote them. They had planned for every contingency except the one that had just happened. The manuals were not a guide to survival. They were an instruction manual for how to use a machine that had been completely destroyed. This bureaucratic fiction was most tragically demonstrated in the case of Reactor 1. Unit 1 was the oldest reactor on the site, and it possessed a relic of a bygone era of nuclear design, an isolation condenser system, or IC. The IC was a beautiful piece of passive engineering. It required no external power to function. It worked on the simple physics of convection. Hot steam from the reactor would rise into a series of pipes submerged in a massive tank of cool water. The steam would condense back into water and, being denser, would flow back down into the reactor. It was a closed loop, a self-regulating cooling engine that could, in theory, have prevented the core from melting for hours, if not days. But the operators in the dark control room couldn't be sure it was working. The valves to activate it had been closed during the earthquake, and while they could be opened manually, the indicators that would confirm their position and the gauges that would show if the system was actually cooling the reactor were all dead. Uncomfortable. Quote, from the TEPCO Emergency Operating Procedure for Unit 1, Section 5.4, Loss of all AC power, 5.4, 1 Operator action. Immediately confirm successful initiation of the isolation condenser system by observing valve position indicators on panel H13P602 and a corresponding pressure decrease on the reactor pressure vessel wide range monitor. 5.4. 2. If IC initiation cannot be confirmed, do not assume functionality. Manually verify and attempt to cycle valves locally. Await restoration of instrument power before proceeding to next step. Do not assume functionality. Await restoration of instrument power. This was the intellectual cage they were trapped in. The one analog, power-free system that could have saved them was hamstrung by a digital age procedure that demanded electronic verification. They were afraid to trust a system they could not see on a screen. Their training had taught them to believe the data, and now, with no data, they were paralyzed by uncertainty. They were flying blind, and their flight manual's first instruction was turn on the instrument panel. The meta-commentary is that the failure was not merely one of hardware, but of software. The human software of procedure and culture. TEPCO had built a system that was incredibly complex but not at all resilient. It was a house of cards that depended on every single card remaining perfectly in place. The manuals were the ultimate expression of this fragility. They were rigid, linear, and unforgiving. They did not empower operators to think. They commanded them to follow a checklist. When reality veered off the checklist, the entire system of human response collapsed with it. The men in the control room were forced to abandon the scripture and become heretics. They began a desperate, improvised scramble scavenging for car batteries to try and power a single vital gauge venturing into dark, unmapped corridors of a plant that was rapidly becoming lethally radioactive, all because the books that were supposed to save them were nothing more than dead weight. While the operators at Fukushima Daiichi were scavenging for car batteries in a desperate flashlight-lit struggle against physics, a very different kind of battle was being waged 150 miles to the south in the earthquake-proof bunkers beneath the Prime Minister's official residence, the Kantei. Here there was no physical darkness, only the blinding glare of fluorescent lights and an information vacuum so profound, it was its own form of terror. Prime Minister Naoto Kan and his cabinet were flying completely blind. They knew a magnitude 9.1 earthquake had savaged the nation. They knew a colossal tsunami had followed, and they knew that the Fukushima Daiichi plant, a critical piece of national infrastructure, had lost external power. Beyond that, they knew almost nothing. In the crucial first hours of the greatest crisis to face Japan since 1945, the government of Japan was not in command. It was a supplicant, begging for data from a private corporation that was actively and deliberately withholding the truth. The reports that trickled in from TEPCO's liaison office were masterpieces of corporate obfuscation. They were delivered in calm, professional tones, filled with technical jargon that sounded impressive but conveyed no actionable intelligence. They spoke of a successful scram. They confirmed the loss of off-site power. They stated they were currently making every effort to confirm the status of the emergency cooling systems. This language was not accidentally vague. It was precision-engineered deception. Making every effort to confirm the status was a euphemism for we have no idea what is happening, because all our instruments are dead. Impaired cooling function was a grotesque understatement, for we have lost all ability to cool 3 reactors that are now beginning to melt. TEPCO never used the phrase station blackout. To do so would have been to speak the unspeakable, to admit to the government that the ultimate nightmare scenario, the one their own safety filings had dismissed as a virtual impossibility, had actually occurred. Admitting that would mean admitting total failure. It would mean surrendering control of the situation, of the narrative, and of their corporate fate to the politicians they so deeply disdained. The dynamic at play was a direct consequence of the nuclear village. For decades, the government had deferred to the supposed expertise of the industry. TEPCO was not just a power company, it was a fiefdom, a technocratic state within a state that viewed government oversight as an annoying formality. In their minds, this was a technical problem to be solved by engineers, not a national catastrophe to be managed by panicked politicians. Their first, second, and third priority was to handle it internally. Bringing the government into the loop with the full, terrifying truth would only lead to chaos, interference, and worst of all, a public panic that could destroy the industry forever. Classified memo. Transcript of a phone call approx 1730 JST from TEPCO Executive Liaison to the Cabinet Office. 2. Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary. We can confirm that all emergency diesel generators at Fukushima Daiichi are currently inoperable due to tsunami inundation. This is a serious but manageable situation. Our on-site teams are highly trained for such contingencies and are currently deploying mobile power sources to the site. The reactor cores remain isolated and we see no immediate threat of a major radioactive release. We urge the Prime Minister's office to avoid any premature public statements that could cause unnecessary confusion. We will provide a more detailed engineering assessment as soon as reliable data becomes available. Serious but manageable. No immediate threat. Avoid premature statements. This is the lexicon of control. TEPCO wasn't updating the government, it was managing it. They were treating the Prime Minister of Japan like a jumpy shareholder who needed to be soothed until the quarterly report was ready. The reality was that mobile power sources were stuck in earthquake-ravaged traffic miles away and would be useless anyway without a place to plug them in. Reliable data was a fantasy when the control room was dark, and no immediate threat was a lie of criminal proportions when 3 cores were already heating uncontrollably toward meltdown. The meta-commentary here is about a fundamental breakdown of the contract between the state and the private entities to which it delegates critical functions. The government had outsourced not just the generation of power, but the custodianship of a technology that held the nation hostage. In the moment of crisis, they discovered that this delegation had come at the cost of control. Prime Minister Khan, a man with a degree in applied physics, grew increasingly furious as the hours dragged on. He understood the basic thermodynamics at play. He knew what a loss of cooling meant, and the vague, happy talk reports from TEPCO were an insult to his intelligence. He was the commander-in-chief of a nation under siege, yet he was locked out of his own armory, forced to trust the very guards who had fallen asleep at their posts and were now desperately trying to pretend nothing was wrong. This information blockade didn't just cause confusion, it cost lives. It delayed meaningful evacuation orders. It crippled the national response. The government wasn't just flying blind. It was being deliberately flown in circles by a pilot who refused to admit the engines had all flamed out. As the hours bled away in the Conte's information-starved bunker, the laws of thermodynamics were writing their own inexorable script inside the steel tombs of Fukushima Daiichi. With all cooling systems gone, the decay heat from the reactor cores was turning the remaining water into a massive, uncontrolled volume of steam. The pressure inside the reactor pressure vessels, RPVs, and the larger primary containment vessels, PCVs, was climbing relentlessly. The operators, working with scavenged car batteries to power a single pressure gauge, could only watch in horror as the needle crept higher and higher into the red. The containment vessel, a structure of steel and reinforced concrete designed to be the final barrier between a melting core and the outside world, was being turned into a colossal, radiological pressure cooker. And it was about to blow. There is a procedure for this. It has a deceptively simple, almost benign name: venting. Venting means deliberately opening a series of valves to release the high-pressure steam from the containment vessel directly into the atmosphere. It is the ultimate devil's bargain of nuclear engineering. It is a last-ditch, desperate act to prevent the entire containment structure from failing catastrophically. A PCV explosion would be a Chernobyl-scale event, an uncontrolled blast that would eject the molten core and massive amounts of radioactive material high into the atmosphere, rendering a huge swath of Japan uninhabitable for centuries. Venting, in comparison, is the lesser of 2 apocalypses. You choose to release a highly radioactive but somewhat filtered plume of steam in a semi-controlled manner, hoping the wind is blowing in a favorable direction. You choose to poison the immediate vicinity to save the entire region. But in March 2011, this choice was not a desperate last resort made in the heat of the moment. It was a slow, agonizing, and calculated decision, paralyzed by the very corporate and political culture that had caused the crisis. The problem was twofold. First, the venting system itself was a product of the plant's fatal design flaws. The valves were not designed to be opened manually with ease. They required electricity, which did not exist. To open them meant sending teams of workers clad in heavy protective gear and breathing from air tanks into the pitch-black, intensely radioactive reactor buildings to turn massive, stubborn valve wheels by hand. These were, for all intents and purposes, suicide missions. Second, and more critically, no one wanted to give the order. For TEPCO, ordering the vent was the final public admission of total failure. It was an irreversible act that would shatter the Anzin Shinhwa into a million pieces. It would prove their plant was not safe, that their procedures had failed, and that they were now actively contaminating Japanese territory. For the government, the political calculus was just as terrifying. Authorizing the release of a radioactive cloud over their own citizens was a politically radioactive act. Where would it go? Who would it harm? What villages and towns lay downwind? They had no answers because, as we know, they were being kept in the dark about the true state of the plant and had no reliable weather data for the microclimate around the site. So they hesitated. For hours, as the pressure climbed to more than double the design limit of the containment vessel, TEPCO executives and government officials engaged in a frantic, circular debate over the phone. TEPCO downplayed the urgency. insisting they were still trying to find ways to restore power. The Prime Minister's office demanded to know why the situation had gotten this bad, and what exactly was in the steam they were being asked to release. Uncomfortable, quote, paraphrased from a heated exchange between a senior Conte advisor and a TEPCO managing director on the night of March 11th. You are telling us we have to do this? That this is the only option? The Prime Minister will not give an order to irradiate his own people without an absolute guarantee from you that it will work and that you know what comes out. The TEPCO director's reply was cold and devoid of apology. The guarantee I can give you is that if we do not vent within the next few hours, the containment for Unit 1 will fail. That is not a risk. It is a certainty. The choice is no longer between radiation and no radiation. The choice is between a release we can attempt to manage and an explosion that will make this area look like the moon. You need to make a decision. There it is. The cold, brutal logic stripped bare of all public relations gloss. We are going to release poison. The only question is whether we do it on our terms or let the laws of physics do it on theirs. This was not about safety. It was about damage control. They were choosing to sacrifice the local population and environment to save the physical machinery of the plant from total obliteration and prevent an even greater political and financial fallout. The meta-commentary on the decision to vent is that it represents the precise moment the disaster transitioned from an industrial accident into a state-sanctioned act of environmental warfare against its own territory. Every reassuring pamphlet about nuclear safety, every cartoon atom smiling in a textbook was rendered a grotesque lie by this single act. The system, faced with its own mortality, chose to save itself by ejecting its poison onto the public it was supposed to protect. The workers who were finally sent into the lethal darkness to crank open those valves were not just saving the plant. They were breaking the seal on a Pandora's box of radioactive isotopes, cesium-137, iodine-131 noble gases, that would contaminate the soil, the water, and the lives of the people of Fukushima for generations to come. The venting of Unit 1 was a Pyrrhic victory, a tactical success that guaranteed a strategic catastrophe. In the early morning hours of March 12th, after teams of workers had absorbed near-lethal doses of radiation to manually crank open the frozen valves, the pressure inside the primary containment vessel finally began to drop. A collective, cautious sigh of relief was breathed in the control room and in the Prime Minister's bunker. They had dodged the bullet. The containment vessel had not exploded, but in their desperate effort to release the steam, they had vented something else along with it, something far more volatile. They had vented a ghost, an invisible, odorless, and ferociously explosive gas, hydrogen. This was not an unforeseen byproduct. The generation of hydrogen gas is one of the most well-known and feared consequences of a severe nuclear accident. It is textbook chemistry, nuclear engineering 101. As the reactor core overheats and the water level drops, the zirconium alloy cladding that encases the uranium fuel pellets is exposed to superheated steam. At temperatures above 2200 degrees Celsius, the zirconium violently oxidizes, essentially stripping the oxygen atoms from the H2O molecules of the steam. This reaction releases two things: even more heat, which accelerates the core melt, and vast quantities of free hydrogen gas. TEPCO's engineers knew this was happening. The temperatures and pressures they were, intermittently, reading could mean nothing else. They knew the core was melting and they knew it was producing hydrogen. When they made the agonizing decision to vent, they knew they were releasing this explosive gas from the containment vessel. But where did it go? The vent pipe didn't lead to a flare stack miles away in the sky. It terminated inside the reactor building itself, the large box-like concrete structure that housed the primary containment vessel. The plan, such as it was, relied on a ventilation system to safely manage the vented gases. But the ventilation system, like everything else, required electricity. It was dead. So the highly explosive hydrogen, mixed with radioactive steam, was simply dumped into the upper levels of the unventilated reactor building, filling the space above the reactor like air in a balloon. For hours the gas accumulated. Every minute of delay, every moment of hesitation in the circular arguments between TEPCO and the Conte had allowed the melting core to produce more and more of this explosive fuel. Their fear of political fallout and their culture of denial had created the very bomb they were now sitting on. At 3:36 p.m. on Saturday, March the 12th, nearly 25 hours after the earthquake, a stray spark, perhaps from a piece of emergency equipment, perhaps from metal grinding on metal, ignited the mixture. The result was a massive detonation. The world watched on live television as the roof and upper walls of the Unit 1 reactor building were blown apart with shocking violence, disintegrating into a cloud of concrete dust and steam. The skeletal steel frame of the building was instantly exposed to the sky, a ghastly gaping wound in the heart of the facility. The explosion was not a nuclear one, but it was the deafening physical manifestation of TEPCO's failure. This was the moment the disaster ceased to be a behind-the-scenes technical problem and became an undeniable, terrifying public spectacle. The lie of a stable or manageable situation was blown to smithereens along with the concrete walls. Uncomfortable. Quote, excerpt from an internal TEPCO engineering log, time-stamped approximately 11 a.m. March 12th. Hydrogen concentration in the Unit 1 PCV is estimated to be well above the lower explosive limit based on core temperature projections. Venting has introduced this gas into the reactor building. The SGTS, standby gas treatment system, is offline. There is a high probability of deflagration or detonation within the structure. We have no means of mitigating this risk without AC power, recommending evacuation of all non-essential personnel from the immediate vicinity. Awaiting headquarters approval to modify on-site exclusion zones. Awaiting headquarters approval. Even in the face of an imminent, predictable explosion, the men on the ground were trapped in a bureaucratic holding pattern. They had to ask permission from an office 150 miles away to protect their own lives from a danger their instruments told them was a near certainty. The culture of top-down, centralized decision-making, a culture deathly afraid of empowering anyone on site to take decisive action, had paralyzed them until it was too late. The meta-commentary is this: the hydrogen explosion was the inevitable, kinetic consequence of their secrecy and indecision. It was physics punishing a flawed corporate culture. For a full day, TEPCO had tried to contain the truth, to manage the narrative, to keep the full horror of the situation behind the fortress walls. But the truth, in the form of hydrogen gas, had built up to an intolerable pressure and then violently burst out into the open for the entire world to see. That plume of smoke and debris rising from the mangled skeleton of Unit 1 was not just a chemical reaction, it was a symbol. It was the physical death of the Anzen Shinwa. It was the final explosive proof that the men in charge were not in control, that their reassurances were worthless, and that the crisis was now escalating into a multi-reactor catastrophe on a scale that few could have imagined. And there were still 2 more reactors, filled with even more hydrogen, ticking right next door. The hydrogen explosion at Unit 1 didn't just shatter concrete, it shattered deniability. The ghastly skeletal remains of the reactor building, now open to the sky, were a public monument to TEPCO's failure. The crisis was no longer a contained internal matter to be managed, with carefully worded press releases and soothing phone calls to the Kante. It was a visible, raging catastrophe. And inside the dark control room, the operators knew the explosion was merely a symptom. The disease was the relentlessly rising temperature in the core. Venting had bought them a little time, but it hadn't solved the fundamental problem. There was no water going into the reactor. The core of Unit 1 was now almost certainly uncovered, melting into a radioactive slag at the bottom of the pressure vessel, and the same fate was rapidly approaching for Units 2 and 3. There was only one solution left. It was obvious, it was terrifying, and it was sitting just a few hundred feet away in limitless supply: the Pacific Ocean. Injecting seawater was the final, brutal, last-ditch option. It was the engineering equivalent of a battlefield amputation. You sacrifice the limb to save the life. Seawater is a fantastic coolant, but it is also phenomenally corrosive to the specialized metals inside a nuclear reactor. The moment salt water touches the internal components of a reactor pressure vessel, its fate is sealed. It is no longer a power-generating asset. It becomes a permanent multi-billion-dollar tomb of radioactive scrap. You can never get the salt out. You can never restart it. It is an act of irreversible, intentional destruction, It is financial suicide. And this is where the timeline of the Fukushima disaster slows to a crawl, paralyzed not by a technical problem, but by an accounting one. On the ground, the plant manager, Masao Yoshida, and his engineers knew what they had to do. They saw a dying patient, and the only medicine available was seawater. But 150 miles away in the Tokyo headquarters, the TEPCO executives saw something different. They saw a line item on a balance sheet worth billions of dollars, an asset they were being asked to voluntarily destroy, and they hesitated, for hour after precious critical hour, while the core temperatures in Unit 1 continued to climb past the melting point of their fuel rods. A furious debate raged. The official request to use seawater was made. The government, led by a now apoplectic Prime Minister Kan, was screaming for action. Kan, with his physics background, understood what was happening. He knew this was no longer about saving a power plant. It was about preventing a chain reaction of meltdowns that could force the evacuation of Tokyo. But TEPCO, in a display of corporate inertia so profound it bordered on the surreal, kept stalling. They insisted they were still trying to source fresh water. They argued they needed to secure a fire engine with enough pumping power. They raised concerns about the technical feasibility of connecting the hoses. These were not genuine engineering concerns. They were delaying tactics. They were the desperate arguments of men clinging to the impossible hope that some other solution might materialize. A solution that wouldn't require them to sign the death warrant for their own flagship asset. Classified memo. Internal TEPCO Executive Committee Communication Summary, March 12th. Subject: Use of seawater at F. Daiichi. The Prime Minister's office is strongly insisting on the immediate implementation of seawater injection for Unit 1. While we acknowledge the severity of the core cooling situation, we must stress that this is an irreversible action with catastrophic financial implications for the company. The asset value of Unit 1 will be reduced to zero. Furthermore, this sets a precedent for Units 2 and 3. We have instructed the on-site team to first exhaust every possible alternative for securing a freshwater source. We cannot authorize the destruction of company assets until all other avenues have been definitively proven to be non-viable. We will communicate to the Conte that we are preparing for the seawater option as a contingency, but are pursuing less destructive measures as a priority. Catastrophic financial implications, destruction of company assets, less destructive measures. This is the language of a boardroom, not an emergency command center. They were weighing the life of a reactor against the lives of the citizens of Japan and finding the calculation difficult. The meta-commentary is chillingly clear. In the crucible of the worst nuclear disaster of the 21st century, the primary instinct of the operator was not to protect the public, but to protect its capital. The hesitation was a direct, calculated gamble. They were betting that they could find another way, and they were staking the safety of the entire nation on that bet. Every minute of delay allowed the core to melt further, increasing the inventory of radioactive material available for release. It allowed more hydrogen to be generated, setting the stage for the next explosion. This wasn't just negligence, it was a conscious choice to prioritize property over people. A decision that stands as one of the most damning indictments of the entire corporate culture that spawned the disaster. The water was right there. The only thing stopping it was a number on a ledger. The standoff was absolute. On one side, the immutable laws of thermodynamics, turning a reactor core into a star in a box. On the other, the equally immutable laws of corporate finance, which viewed the destruction of a multi-billion yen asset as a sin greater than any other. In the middle was Masao Yoshida, the plant manager of Fukushima Daiichi, a company man, a lifer, a product of the very TEPCO system that had led them to this precipice. He was not a natural rebel. He was a manager, a bureaucrat, a man who had built a career on following procedures and respecting the chain of command. But he was also the man on the ground. He was the one breathing the acrid air, the one seeing the terror in his workers' eyes, the one who understood in his bones the physical reality of what was happening in a way no executive in a distant Tokyo high-rise ever could. After hours of infuriating circular arguments, permission was finally, grudgingly, granted. Seawater injection began at Unit 1. A jury-rigged system of fire engines and hastily laid hoses started pumping the cold, salty Pacific into the overheating reactor. It was a desperate, ugly, but necessary act. For a brief moment, it seemed like the chain of command, however strained, was functioning. Then, the unthinkable happened. A direct order came from TEPCO headquarters in Tokyo. Cease seawater injection immediately. The official reasoning given was a fiction, a claim that they were trying to switch to a freshwater line, or that they needed to reconfigure the pumps. But the real reason was a final, spasmodic attempt by the corporate brain to protect its assets. Perhaps they believed the Prime Minister's fury would cool. Perhaps they had a hallucination of another solution. The reason was irrelevant. The order was insane. Stopping the water now would be worse than having never started. The initial injection had created a massive thermal shock inside the pressure vessel. Halting it would allow the core to flash heat the remaining water, creating a steam explosion that could rupture the already damaged vessel completely. It was a move that defied all engineering logic. It was an order born of panic and financial delusion. And in the chaotic makeshift command center at Fukushima Daiichi, Masao Yoshida was faced with a choice that would define not just his life, but the fate of his country. He could obey the direct command of his superiors, the men who signed his paychecks, and condemn them all to an even greater catastrophe. Or he could commit the ultimate corporate sin. He could disobey, in what would later become the single most consequential act of insubordination in the history of the nuclear industry. Yoshida turned to his men and uttered a quiet, history-altering command. He told them to keep pumping. Then he got on the phone with Tokyo and, in a masterful display of bureaucratic sabotage, played for time. He pretended the connection was bad. He asked for clarification. He created a fog of confusion, all while knowing that the pumps his men were operating were still pouring life-saving seawater into the dying reactor. He was consciously and deliberately disobeying a direct order from his employer in the middle of a Level 7 nuclear accident. Uncomfortable. Quote, from the sworn testimony of a junior engineer present in the on-site command center, the call came from the head office. The order was explicit. Stop the seawater. Everyone looked at Yoshida-san. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the pressure readings, which were finally starting to stabilize. Then he looked at us. He said, "Do not stop." To the phone, he said something like, "We are having trouble communicating the order to the teams at the pump site due to the blackout." He knew it was a lie. We all knew it was a lie. He was saving us from them. He was saving them from their own leadership. This act of defiance was the firewall. It was the moment one man, faced with a choice between loyalty to a broken system and loyalty to reality, chose reality. Yoshida's decision was not a guarantee of success, but it was the only thing that prevented certain, immediate, and far more horrific failure. Without his insubordination, the core of Unit 1 would have likely melted through the pressure vessel that night, leading to a cataclysmic interaction with the concrete below and an uncontrolled radiological release that would have dwarfed what eventually occurred. The meta-commentary on Masao Yoshida's defiance is a profound and deeply cynical one. He is rightly remembered as a hero, but the necessity of his heroism is the ultimate condemnation of the system he worked for. A safe, resilient, and responsible organization does not require a mid-level manager to commit career suicide to prevent a national apocalypse. The fact that the single most important, safety-critical decision of the entire crisis was an act of insubordination proves that the corporate and regulatory structure was not just flawed, but fundamentally inverted. Its priorities were backward. Its chain of command in the moment of ultimate crisis became a vector for catastrophic instructions. Masao Yoshida didn't just fight a meltdown, he fought his own bosses. And in winning that fight, he exposed the truth that the greatest threat to Fukushima wasn't the earthquake or the tsunami, but the calculated, reality-denying culture of the very company entrusted to run it. While Masao Yoshida was committing career treason on the front lines to keep water flowing into a melting reactor, his ultimate superior, Prime Minister Naoto Kan, was reaching a volcanic breaking point. For nearly a full day, he had been a prisoner in his own command center, a leader held hostage by the deliberate, infuriatingly calm lies of a private company. He had been told the plant was stable, and then it exploded. He had been told the cooling systems were being managed and then learned they were all dead. He had been assured that TEPCO's highly trained teams were handling the situation, only to discover through back channels that they were considering a full withdrawal of all personnel from the site, an act that would mean abandoning all 6 reactors to their fate, a guaranteed nuclear fire that would poison the Northern Hemisphere. This was the final betrayal. The thought of TEPCO simply walking away, leaving the nation to deal with a cascading, unmitigated apocalypse, was an act of corporate treason so profound it snapped something in Can. He was done with phone calls. He was done with liaisons. He was done being managed. At 5 a.m. on March 12th, in a move that had no precedent in modern Japanese history, Naoto Kan announced he was going to TEPCO headquarters himself. His aides were aghast. It was a spectacular breach of protocol. The Prime Minister doesn't go to a company during a crisis, the company comes to him. But Kan understood what his staff did not. This was no longer a negotiation. This was a hostile takeover. The government of Japan had lost control of a national security threat, and the only way to get it back was to physically seize the command post. The scene at TEPCO's Tokyo headquarters was one of surreal disbelief. The executives, already pale and sleep-deprived, were now confronted with the arrival of the Prime Minister of Japan, his face a mask of cold fury, flanked by security and his own nuclear advisors. This wasn't a visit. It was an occupation. Kan stormed into their emergency response center, a room of stunned engineers and executives, and effectively declared himself commander-in-chief of the operation. He established a joint government TEPCO response headquarters on the spot, an entity that had no legal basis, but was created by the sheer force of his will. He was done asking for reports. From now on, he would stand over their shoulders while they wrote them. The confrontation that followed has become the stuff of legend, a moment where the polite, face-saving conventions of Japanese society were burned away by the raw heat of the crisis. Kan, a man with a science degree who understood the physics of what was happening better than most politicians, tore into the assembled TEPCO leadership. He was not there to cooperate. He was there to issue an ultimatum. Uncomfortable. Quote, a reconstruction of Prime Minister Naoto Kan's outburst at TEPCO headquarters based on multiple eyewitness accounts. What the hell is going on? The television is showing an explosion and you are telling me nothing. For hours you have fed us nothing. Now I hear you are thinking of pulling your men out. Are you insane? You are going to abandon this plant? Let me be clear. There is a 99% chance you are all going to die here. But you are not leaving. If you withdraw, TEPCO is finished. The company will be destroyed. Japan will be destroyed. You will not run. You will die at your posts if you have to. This is an order. This was not the language of governance. It was the language of war. It was the raw, furious admission that the system had completely failed. The social contract between the state and its critical industries had been revealed as a worthless piece of paper. The Prime Minister's invasion of TEPCO was the ultimate vote of no confidence, a televised declaration that the Japanese government believed the operator of its nuclear plants was too incompetent, dishonest, or cowardly to be trusted to manage the crisis on its own. The meta-commentary is devastating. This unprecedented act wasn't a sign of a strong leader taking charge. It was the desperate gambit of a leader who had discovered he had no real power. The nuclear village had created a system so insular, so arrogant, and so unaccountable that it was functionally immune to normal government oversight. In the moment of ultimate peril, the elected leader of the nation had to resort to the tactics of a warlord, a physical show of force and direct threats just to get a straight answer. He had to personally storm the walls of the corporate castle, because the messengers he sent were either turned away or fed poison. Kan's furious intervention may have prevented TEPCO from abandoning the plant, but it also exposed the terrifying truth that in Japan's technocratic state, the government reigned, but it did not rule. The real power lay with the unaccountable corporate entities it had created, and reclaiming that power required an act of open political warfare. Prime Minister Kan's dramatic sunrise raid on TEPCO headquarters was a political explosion, but it did not, as he had hoped, break the information dam. It simply changed the way the water was being diverted. The government was now physically inside the castle, But TEPCO still held the keys to every room. The Joint Response Headquarters was a cosmetic creation. In reality, it was two separate, deeply suspicious entities occupying the same space. On one side, government officials, desperate for a clear picture of the unfolding nightmare. On the other, TEPCO engineers and executives who had now shifted their strategy from outright stonewalling to a far more insidious campaign of curated truth and malicious compliance. They understood they could no longer simply ignore the Prime Minister. So they began to manage him. They provided data, but it was data stripped of context. They answered questions, but only the specific questions that were asked, never volunteering the terrifying information that lay just beyond the query. They created a carefully constructed reality for the Conte, a version of the disaster that was always serious but never quite as catastrophic as it was in reality. This was not born of panic. It was a deliberate, calculated policy. Internal communications and later testimony would reveal the chilling, paternalistic logic behind this deception. TEPCO's leadership genuinely believed that the politicians, and by extension the public, were too ignorant and too emotional to handle the unvarnished, terrifying truth. They saw government interference and unnecessary public panic as threats on par with the meltdowns themselves. In their profoundly arrogant worldview, their job was not just to control the reactors, but to control the national psyche. The information apartheid was absolute. When government officials asked about the state of the reactor core in Unit 1, TEPCO would respond with carefully selected phrases like severe core damage is suspected. This was technically true, but it was a lie of omission on a staggering scale. Their own internal computer models, based on the temperature and pressure data they were hoarding, were painting a picture of a near 100% core melt. They knew the uranium fuel had likely slumped into a molten corium lava at the bottom of the pressure vessel. The difference between damage and melt is the difference between a car crash and a plane crash. They were reporting a fender bender, while knowing the plane had hit the mountain. The same deception applied to radiation readings. The teams Yoshida sent on suicide missions into the reactor buildings were carrying dosimeters. They were getting real-time, terrifyingly high readings from the field. A government official might ask, "What are the radiation levels at the plant gate?" TEPCO would provide that number, a relatively low figure from a kilometer away. They would not volunteer the fact that readings inside the turbine building were so high they could kill a man in minutes, a clear indicator that the primary containment had been breached and was leaking its radioactive guts into the surrounding structures. They weren't lying. They were just answering a different question than the one that should have been asked. Classified Memo. Internal TEPCO Risk Communication Directive, issued March 13th. To all liaisons assigned to the Joint Response Headquarters, all data shared with government representatives must be vetted through the on-site shift supervisor and the Tokyo main office. Provide summary-level information only. Do not share raw telemetry, core melt progression models, or source term radiation calculations. The government's need to know is limited to information required for their public safety announcements. Our primary directive is to maintain operational focus. Speculative or unconfirmed data will only create political distraction and impede the technical team's ability to execute its recovery strategy. We are the experts. We will manage the flow of information to ensure a calm and reasoned response. We are the experts. We will manage the flow of information. This is the core of the rot. It is the voice of a technocratic priesthood that believes its knowledge gives it the right to treat the elected government of a democratic nation as a child. To be protected from truths, it is too simple to understand. This calculated information blackout had devastating real-world consequences. Remember the decision to vent? The government had to make that choice while being deliberately misled about the sheer volume of hard radiation and hydrogen that TEPCO knew would be released. More critically, as we will see, this information gap would directly lead to the botched, chaotic, and often deadly evacuations of the towns and villages surrounding the plant. The meta-commentary is a stark warning about the tyranny of expertise. In a complex technological society, we are forced to place our trust in specialists. But TEPCO's actions at Fukushima demonstrate the dark potential of that trust. When the specialists believe that their expertise exempts them from the obligation of transparency, they cease to be public servants and become a ruling class, accountable only to themselves. They created two parallel disasters, the physical one unfolding within the reactor cores, and the informational one unfolding in the minds of the nation's leaders. The government was trying to fight a monster, but the monster's handler kept insisting it was just a large, agitated dog, right up until the moment it tore the city down. The informational containment field was now fully engaged. While Prime Minister Khan raged behind closed doors, the public face of the crisis, presented by TEPCO spokesmen and government officials like Chief Cabinet Secretary Yukio Edano, was one of grim-faced, sleepless competence. The world was fed a steady diet of carefully chosen words. The situation was grave. The challenges were unprecedented. But the narrative was always anchored by the same reassuring and utterly false premise, that the situation was, in some fundamental way, being brought under control. They spoke of securing the cooling function, of efforts to reduce pressure, of monitoring radiation levels. These phrases painted a picture of a desperate but heroic battle, of skilled engineers fighting to tame a damaged but ultimately knowable machine. This was perhaps the most cynical lie of the entire catastrophe. They were not fighting to control 3 reactors. They were fighting to contain the fallout from 3 nuclear volcanoes that had already erupted. The very concept of control was a public relations fantasy. Behind the curtain of their vetted summary-level data, the reality inside the reactor buildings was a scene from Dante's Inferno, a trilogy of atomic decay playing out in parallel. In Unit 1, the core was long gone. The severe core damage they alluded to was a grotesque understatement. The uranium fuel, having melted at 2,800 degrees Celsius, had formed a molten, lava-like substance called corium, a hideous amalgam of fuel, cladding, and control rods. This superheated, radioactive slag had burned through the bottom of the 9-inch thick steel reactor pressure vessel as if it were parchment. It was now slumping onto the concrete floor of the primary containment vessel, attacking the final layer of defense. This was no longer a damaged core. This was a melt-through, a term TEPCO and the government would refuse to use for months. Unit 3 was a terrifying echo of Unit 1, but on a larger scale. It was a more powerful reactor, and its core contained not just uranium but highly toxic mixed oxide, MOX, fuel. The core was now largely uncovered, and the zirconium steam reaction was producing hydrogen at a furious rate. The building was filling with explosive gas just as its neighbor had done. The seawater injection, a desperate last resort, was failing. The pressure from the uncontrolled steam generation inside the reactor was so immense that it was fighting back against the low-pressure fire hoses, preventing sufficient water from getting in. It was a ticking bomb, and everyone in the know was simply waiting for the inevitable detonation. And then there was Unit 2. While the world's attention was fixed on the smoking ruin of Unit 1 and the impending doom of Unit 3, Unit 2 was failing in a quieter, more sinister way. Its own passive cooling system had failed early on. The operators couldn't get water into it. The pressure inside its containment vessel, after spiking dangerously, began to inexplicably drop. This was presented by some as a hopeful sign, a potential stabilization. It was the opposite. It was the sound of the tomb cracking open. A sustained drop in pressure without successful cooling could mean only one thing. The containment was breached. It was leaking. Unit 2 wasn't exploding. It was hemorrhaging the deadliest, most concentrated radioactive poisons directly into the environment without the cleansing fire of a detonation. It was the stealth catastrophe, the silent killer of the trio. Classified memo. Draft talking points for cabinet press briefing. Date: March 13, 2011. Key message: government and TEPCO are working as one. The situation remains serious, but stabilization efforts are the sole priority. Do use: taking all available measures, core is being cooled, efforts to protect public health and safety. Do not use: meltdown, core melt, loss of containment, uncontrolled release. When asked about core status, reply: the reactor is in a severe condition, but we are injecting seawater to ensure it remains cooled. When asked about radiation, reply: we are monitoring levels closely and will take action as necessary. The objective is to prevent panic and project resolve, to prevent panic. The lie was a strategy. It was an informational containment vessel designed to hold back a truth they believed the world couldn't handle. They were not just managing a nuclear accident. They were performing perception management on a global scale. Acknowledging a triple meltdown, a triple containment breach, and a probable triple melt-through would have triggered a global market panic. It would have led to calls for the evacuation of Tokyo. It would have shattered the international reputation of Japanese technology and governance beyond repair. It would have been Japan's Chernobyl, an admission of failure on a civilizational scale. The meta-commentary is this: the lie of control was a second, more insidious kind of radiation. It spread silently, invisibly, and it did its own unique form of damage. It crippled the ability of the international community to offer meaningful, targeted help. It poisoned the well of public trust so thoroughly that to this day, millions of Japanese citizens believe nothing the government or TEPCO says. And most tragically, it shaped the disastrously flawed evacuation plans, where communities were moved not based on where the real radiation plumes were going, but on where the official narrative said it was safe to be. The officials stood before the cameras and spoke of control, while knowing with absolute certainty that 3 cores were actively melting their way to the center of the Earth. A lie that vast and fundamental, the lie of control, cannot survive on corporate press releases and political speeches alone. It is too abstract. It needs a human face. It needs a story. And as the world watched the Fukushima Daiichi plant tear itself apart in a series of explosions and silent, invisible hemorrhages of radiation, a story began to emerge from the chaos. It was a story the media, the public, and even the Japanese government desperately needed. The story of the Fukushima 50. In the days following the station blackout, as the vast majority of the plant's 800 workers were evacuated, a small, skeletal crew remained behind. The number fluctuated, growing from an initial 50 to a few hundred, but the name stuck: the Fukushima 50. They were instantly mythologized. The global press, starved for a hero in a narrative of relentless technological failure, seized upon the image. They were dubbed atomic samurai, modern-day warriors, sacrificing themselves for the nation. They were faceless, nameless heroes clad in white protective suits, battling an unseen dragon in the heart of a ruined castle. It was a powerful, irresistible narrative. It tapped into ancient archetypes of duty, honor, and self-sacrifice. It provided a focal point for hope and admiration amidst the horror. Here was proof that even when the machines failed, the human spirit endured. The story was a godsend, a perfect, gleaming counter-narrative to the grim reality of corporate negligence and regulatory collapse. And it was, from the very beginning, a public relations campaign. While the men themselves were undeniably brave, the swift and deliberate mythologization of their struggle was no accident. It was the single most successful piece of perception management that TEPCO and the Japanese government pulled off. The story of the Fukushima 50 was not just a report, it was a strategy. It was a tool to reframe the entire disaster. It shifted the world's focus from the unforgivable failures of the past, the buried reports, the inadequate seawall, the arrogant culture of denial, to the heroic actions of the present. It was a classic misdirection. Don't look at the arsonist. Look at the brave firefighter he forced into the blaze. Classified memo. From a crisis communications consultant to TEPCO's public relations division. Subject: narrative framing and reputational mitigation. Date: March 14, 2011. The current news cycle is overwhelmingly negative, focusing on corporate culpability. This is reputationally catastrophic. We must pivot. The workers remaining on site angle offers a powerful opportunity to re-center the narrative around themes of heroism, duty, and national resilience. We must leverage this human interest story to its fullest extent. I recommend we coin a simple, powerful moniker, the Fukushima Heroes or the Daiichi 50, and feed it to our international media contacts. By elevating the workers to the status of national heroes, we transform a story of corporate failure into a story of human courage. This will not erase our liability, but it will create a powerful emotional buffer and shift the immediate public discourse from blame to admiration. Create a powerful emotional buffer. Shift the discourse from blame to admiration. This is the cold, cynical calculus behind the hero narrative. The Fukushima 50 weren't just fighting radiation, they were serving as a human shield for TEPCO's reputation. Their sacrifice was being weaponized in real time to protect the executives in the system that had put them in an impossible, life-threatening position. The reality for these men was not a heroic movie poster, it was a vision of hell. They were working in pitch darkness, navigating corridors slick with radioactive water. They shared meager rations of dry crackers and slept in shifts on the floor of lead-lined rooms, their bodies absorbing the daily radiation limits for an entire year in a matter of hours. They were surrounded by the constant threat of further explosions and the terrifying, omnipresent Geiger counter crackle that was the soundtrack to their slow-motion execution. Their heroism was real, but it was a heroism forged from desperation, not choice. They were there because their employer had failed so catastrophically that the only thing standing between northern Japan and a permanent radiological wasteland was a handful of exhausted men with flashlights and failing equipment. To celebrate their bravery without screaming about the negligence that made it necessary is the ultimate moral failure. It's like praising the courage of a man who jumps onto a live grenade without mentioning that his own commanding officer is the one who dropped it in the trench. The meta-commentary is this. The story of the Fukushima 50, as it was packaged and sold to the world, became the final layer of TEPCO's containment strategy. It contained the public's rage. It contained the media's focus. It contained the most inconvenient questions. By turning the workers into saints, they made their employers' sins harder to see. And so, the world praised the sacrifice, while the system that demanded that sacrifice remained fundamentally unchanged, protected by the very heroes it had created. While the myth of the Fukushima 50 was being expertly crafted and disseminated to a grateful world, a far more insidious and revealing battle was being waged behind the scenes. It was a war not of fire hoses and radiation suits, but of dictionaries and semantics. It was the 2-month-long war against a single 8-letter word, meltdown. From the very first days of the crisis, it was the ghost at the press conference, the word that every journalist asked, and no official would ever utter. They danced around it with a linguistic agility that would have been impressive if it weren't so transparently dishonest. The official terminology, repeated like a mantra by TEPCO spokesmen and government officials, was Roshin Sonsho, which translates to core damage. Sometimes it was elevated to significant core damage or fuel rod damage. To the international press, it was a constant, frustrating refusal to state the obvious. But to the engineers inside TEPCO, this word game was a farce of the highest order. TEPCO's own internal pre-crisis operating manuals had a clear, unambiguous definition of a meltdown. It was the point at which significant overheating causes damage to more than 5% of the fuel in the reactor core. By that standard, Fukushima Daiichi didn't just experience a meltdown. It experienced 3 of the most rapid and complete meltdowns in history within 72 hours of the earthquake. Their own data, the fragmented readings they managed to get from scavenged batteries and the projections from their own computer models, told them a clear story. The damage wasn't 5%. It was 50%, then 70%, and in the case of Unit 1, almost certainly 100%. They knew this. From day one, they knew this. Yet for 2 full months, they lied. The refusal to use the word meltdown was a deliberate, top-down, coordinated strategy between the company and the state. It was a policy. Why? Because the word itself had a power that transcended its technical definition. Core damage is an industrial accident. It sounds manageable, technical, something for engineers to sort out. Meltdown is a civilizational event. It is a synonym for the apocalypse. It is Chernobyl. It is 3 Mile Island. It is the ultimate nightmare of the atomic age, a word that conjures images of invisible poisons, abandoned cities, and a permanent, incurable wound on the face of the earth. To admit to a meltdown was to admit to a total, catastrophic loss of control. It was to officially surrender. It would trigger international protocols, invite foreign oversight, and, most importantly, unleash a torrent of legal and financial consequences that would utterly destroy TEPCO and could bankrupt the Japanese state. It was the trigger word for a national declaration of failure, and so they decided collectively to simply pretend it wasn't happening by refusing to name it. Classified memo from the Prime Minister's Office of Crisis Communications to the NISA liaison. Subject: Approved Lexicon for Public Statements, Kobe, Fukushima Daiichi. Date: March 15, 2011. Under no circumstances are any government officials or agency representatives to use the term meltdown, or its Japanese equivalent marutodon. This word carries an unacceptable level of emotional and political contagion. Its use will incite public panic, trigger a catastrophic collapse in the financial markets, and irrevocably damage our nation's international standing. All public-facing communications must adhere strictly to the approved term, core damage, Roshin Sonsho. This accurately reflects the technical situation without invoking the historically loaded and unhelpful connotations of meltdown. This is a matter of national security and economic stability. There will be no exceptions. Unacceptable level of emotional and political contagion. Unhelpful connotations. This is the language of perception managers who have come to believe that reality is something you construct with talking points. They were not trying to inform the public. They were trying to sedate them. This absurd semantic war reached its peak in April, when the government finally raised the accident level to 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, the highest possible level, equal only to Chernobyl. In one breath, they were telling the world that the disaster was in the same category as the worst nuclear accident in human history. In the next, they continued to insist it was not a meltdown. It was an act of cognitive dissonance so profound it bordered on a national psychosis. The meta-commentary is this: the war on the word meltdown was a perfect microcosm of the entire Fukushima disaster. It revealed the core rottenness of the nuclear village more clearly than any technical failure. Their first instinct, when faced with a catastrophic truth, was not to confront it but to rename it. They believed that by controlling the language, they could control the reality. It was an act of profound arrogance and even deeper cowardice. This 2-month lie did more to destroy TEPCO's and the government's credibility than any hydrogen explosion. The explosions were physics. The lie was a choice. When the admission finally came, in a grudging press release in mid-May, it wasn't a revelation. It was an insult. The world had known for months. The only thing the admission confirmed was that the people in charge had been lying, consistently and deliberately from the very beginning. The 2-month war against the word meltdown was not just an exercise in abstract deception. It was a lie that had a geography, a lie that had a trajectory. While officials in Tokyo were meticulously curating their language to prevent emotional contagion, a real physical contagion was being carried on the wind, and they had a map that showed exactly where it was going. They just chose not to look at it. Or more accurately, they chose not to show it to anyone else. This brings us to the single most unforgivable act of state betrayal in the entire Fukushima saga: the deliberate suppression of the SPEEDI data. SPEEDI stands for the System for Prediction of Environmental Emergency Dose Information. It is not some obscure academic model. It was and is a world-class government-funded, nationwide atmospheric dispersion prediction system. Its entire reason for existence, the very purpose for which the Japanese taxpayers had paid hundreds of millions of yen to develop and maintain it, was for this exact moment. In the event of a radiological release from a nuclear power plant, SPEEDI was designed to take 2 sets of data: the source term, what radioactive materials are being released and how much. As the radioactive steam and hydrogen began spewing from the vented, exploding, and leaking reactors, the scientists at Japan's Ministry of Science and Technology, MEXT, activated the system. The problem was TEPCO, in its campaign of informational containment, was refusing to provide an accurate source term. They wouldn't admit how much radiation was escaping. So the SPEEDI scientists did the next best thing. They made an educated guess. They assumed a hypothetical but realistic release rate and began running the simulations. The maps that began to generate on their computer screens were horrifying. They showed that the plume was not spreading out in a neat, uniform circle from the plant, as a simple-minded bureaucrat might assume. The weather patterns over the Fukushima coast were complex. The plume was being channeled by hills and valleys, pushed by shifting winds, and pulled to the ground by rain and snow. The map showed the invisible poison was flowing in a long, concentrated tendril, snaking its way northwest from the plant. This prediction was a piece of intelligence so vital, so critical to public safety, that it should have been broadcast on every television station in the country. It should have been in the hands of every mayor, every police chief, every emergency responder in the region. The government knew this. The Prime Minister's office was made aware of the speedy simulations within days of the accident, and they made a conscious, deliberate decision to bury them. Classified memo. Internal recommendation from the Cabinet Office for Crisis Management to the Chief Cabinet Secretary. Date: March 15, 2011. Subject: Public release of speedy projections. The projections from the speedy system have been reviewed. While the model is robust, the public release of these plume maps is deemed inadvisable at this time. The data is complex and could be easily misinterpreted by the public, leading to widespread and uncontrollable panic in prefectures far beyond the current evacuation zone. A dynamic evacuation based on these constantly shifting plumes would be logistically impossible and would undermine public confidence in the government's crisis management. Furthermore, releasing maps that graphically depict a massive radioactive release would directly contradict our official position that there is no immediate threat to public health. We recommend continuing with the clear, easily understood concentric circle evacuation zones. The speedy data will be held for internal assessment only. Inadvisable, logistically impossible, undermine public confidence. This is the bureaucratic mind at its most monstrous. It is the logic of an administrator who prioritizes a clean, orderly process over a messy, life-saving one. They looked at a map that could have saved their citizens from radiation exposure and saw only a public relations problem. They chose to protect the official narrative rather than the people. The meta-commentary on the suppression of the speedy data is that it is the purest distillation of the entire Fukushima lie. This was not a failure of technology. It was a failure of morality. The system built to protect the people was deliberately turned off to protect the system itself. The consequences of this decision are written in the medical records of the people of towns like Iitate and Namie. Iitate, a village 40 kilometers northwest of the plant and well outside the initial evacuation zone, became one of the most heavily contaminated areas in Japan because the wind blew the poison there, just as Speedy predicted. Its residents were told they were safe for weeks. They breathed the air, drank the water, and ate the food from their gardens while invisible particles of cesium rained down upon them. This was not an accident. It was a direct consequence of a decision made in an office in Tokyo to hide a map. It was the moment the government's role shifted from incompetent protector to active, negligent agent of harm. The decision to hide the speedy maps was the ultimate act of domestic information control, a government choosing to blind its own citizens to a clear and present danger. But the walls of the nuclear village were not built just to keep the Japanese people in the dark. They were also built to keep the outside world out. As the crisis spiraled into a multi-reactor meltdown, the most powerful nation on Earth, Japan's staunchest military and political ally, was watching with growing, unadulterated terror. And when the United States of America offered its full, overwhelming technical and military support, it ran headfirst into a wall of polite, infuriating, and deeply pathological resistance. The American response was not trivial. This wasn't a token offer of blankets and bottled water. The U.S. Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, were running their own frantic back-of-the-envelope calculations, and their models were screaming a truth that TEPCO was still denying. This was a triple meltdown, and the potential for a catastrophe that could force the evacuation of U.S. military bases and even threaten the West Coast was very real. Within hours, the American military in Japan, under the umbrella of Operation Tomodachi, was mobilizing a massive aid effort. More specifically, they were offering a suite of high-technology tools and world-class expertise tailor-made for this exact crisis. They offered to fly their Global Hawk and U-2 surveillance drones, equipped with thermal imaging and radiological sensors, directly over the stricken reactors. These drones could have provided what the Japanese desperately lacked: a clear, real-time picture of the physical damage and a map of the radiation hotspots, all without risking a single human life. They offered specialized radiation detection teams with experience from 3 Mile Island and Cold War cleanup sites. They offered heavy lift helicopters to drop water and boron. They offered a legion of their best nuclear engineers from the national labs, the very people who designed and managed America's own atomic arsenal and power grid. It was an offer to bring a sledgehammer to a problem that the Japanese were trying to solve with chopsticks. And the answer they got back was, in essence, "Thank you. We'll call you if we need you." The offers were not rejected outright. That would have been a diplomatic insult. They were stonewalled. They were smothered in a thick blanket of Japanese bureaucratic procedure. American requests for data were met with the same vague non-answers that Prime Minister Khan was receiving. TEPCO and Japanese officials insisted that the situation was under their control. They raised concerns about sovereignty over Japanese airspace. They claimed that American equipment might not be compatible with their systems. They asked for endless meetings to coordinate and harmonize the potential aid. It was a slow, polite, and maddening dance of deflection, a masterclass in saying no without ever using the word. The root of this resistance was the same disease that had caused the disaster: a toxic cocktail of national pride, institutional arrogance, and a pathological fear of losing face. For the nuclear village, admitting they needed American help was a confession of ultimate failure. It would mean admitting that their vaunted technological prowess was a sham. More dangerously, they feared what the Americans would find. If American teams with their own independent sensors got on site, the lie of core damage would be exposed instantly. The lie of controlled releases would evaporate. The full, terrifying scope of TEPCO's negligence would be laid bare for the entire world to see. It was better, in their view, to risk a greater radiological disaster than to suffer the certainty of total, global humiliation. Classified memo from the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, MITI, to the Prime Minister's office. Subject: regarding U.S. offers of technical assistance at Fukushima Daiichi. Date: March 16, 2011. While we appreciate the extensive offers of support from our American allies, we must proceed with the utmost caution. Allowing a large-scale deployment of foreign technical teams directly on the Daiichi site could lead to a loss of operational sovereignty and create a chaotic dual chain of command. Furthermore, independent data collection by U.S. assets could generate conflicting information, undermining our government's unified public messaging and creating unnecessary confusion. Our priority is to demonstrate that this situation can be managed and contained by Japanese expertise and technology. We will continue to accept logistical and humanitarian support, but all core technical operations must remain under Japanese control. We will form a joint committee to evaluate and process specific U.S. requests for technical integration. Loss of operational sovereignty, conflicting information, Japanese expertise. This is the language of a fortress under siege, trying to repel its own rescuers. The formation of a joint committee is the classic bureaucratic maneuver for killing an idea with endless deliberation. The meta-commentary here is a tragic portrait of national pride as a public health threat. While the Fukushima 50 were risking their lives in the dark, and citizens in Iitate were being irradiated because their government was hiding the plume maps, that same government was telling the world's foremost nuclear experts to please wait in the lobby and fill out the appropriate forms. This wasn't just a clash of cultures. It was a clash between a pragmatic, problem-solving mindset and a shame-based, narrative-preserving one. The American approach was, the house is on fire, let's get every fire hose we can find. The official Japanese response was, please don't look at the fire, it's embarrassing, and we have a very specific, face-saving way we'd like to put it out ourselves, thank you very much. As the Americans were being politely stonewalled and the Japanese public was being actively misled, another key player arrived on the scene, cloaked in the august authority of international law and scientific objectivity. This was the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, the United Nations official nuclear watchdog. On paper, their arrival should have been the moment the truth finally broke free. Here was the impartial global referee, a body with the mandate to assess nuclear safety, investigate accidents, and deliver unvarnished facts to the world community. In reality, the IAEA's arrival was the beginning of the final and most sophisticated act of containment, the diplomatic whitewash. The IAEA is not a global nuclear police force. It is a political body, a members' club of nuclear-powered states. Its dual mandate is its original sin. It is tasked with both promoting the peaceful use of nuclear energy and regulating its safety. It cannot be a harsh critic without undermining its role as a cheerleader. It is a watchdog that must be careful not to bite the hands of the powerful owners who feed it. And in March 2011, the Director General of this supposedly impartial body was a Japanese diplomat, Yukiya Amano. The optics were already compromised. The man responsible for investigating Japan's worst-ever nuclear disaster was a product of the very same elite, consensus-driven bureaucratic culture that had enabled it. When the first IAEA teams arrived in Japan, they were not given carte blanche. They were not a forensic unit kicking down doors and seizing logs. They were guests of the state. Their access was carefully managed. Their briefings were delivered by the same TEPCO and government officials who were masters of the curated truth. They were given the same summary-level data, the same vague assurances, the same tour of the stable parts of the crisis. The Japanese government wasn't just managing its own public, it was now managing the world's regulator. The IAEA, bound by the protocols of diplomacy, could not simply accuse a G7 member state of lying or incompetence. They had to perform a delicate dance, expressing concern while validating the strenuous efforts of their hosts. The initial reports that emerged from the IAEA were masterpieces of diplomatic ambiguity. They were filled with passive verbs and cautious, heavily qualified statements. They noted the hydrogen explosions. They were informed by Japanese authorities about the seawater injection. They welcomed the efforts to restore power. There was no condemnation. There was no independent verification of TEPCO's claims. There was no forceful public declaration that the agency was being denied the critical data it needed to make a real assessment. Reading the early IAEA bulletins is like reading a weather report written by someone who is forbidden from using the word hurricane. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a private, off-the-record briefing by a senior European IAEA official to his home government US ambassador in Tokyo, late March 2011. You must understand our position. We are not an adversarial body. Our mandate is to work with member states. We cannot publicly contradict the information provided by the host government without precipitating a full-blown diplomatic crisis. Privately? Yes, we see the same gaps you do. We know core damage is a laughable euphemism. We know the release figures they are giving us are a fraction of the reality. But our job in the initial phase is to maintain stability and facilitate information sharing, not to assign blame. A public accusation of a cover-up would cause a global market collapse and make our continued presence here impossible. We are reporting what we are officially told. The truth will have to wait for the autopsy. The truth will have to wait for the autopsy. There it is. The prime directive of the international bureaucracy. Do not spook the markets. Do not upset the delicate balance of power. The IAEA's first priority was not scientific truth. It was political and economic stability. It chose to act as a stenographer for the official Japanese narrative, lending its global credibility to a story it privately knew to be a fiction. It validated the lie by refusing to challenge it. The meta-commentary on the IAEA's performance is a damning indictment of the entire global nuclear safety regime. It revealed the agency to be what its critics had long claimed, a toothless watchdog. Its structural conflict of interest, promoting and regulating the same technology, makes it constitutionally incapable of acting as a true aggressive regulator in a crisis involving one of its powerful members. It is designed to catch the mistakes of a small, developing nation's nuclear program, not to challenge the foundational lies of an economic superpower. By prioritizing diplomacy over disclosure, the IAEA became a willing, if reluctant, partner in the information containment strategy. It became part of the nuclear village, another layer of insulation protecting the guilty and keeping the full, terrifying truth from a world that was looking to it for answers. With the international watchdog effectively sedated and performing its duty as a diplomatic stenographer, The architects of the nuclear village turned their full attention to the final, most crucial act of containment, the containment of history itself. A catastrophe of this magnitude cannot simply be left as a messy, complicated story of cascading human errors. It is too dangerous. A complex truth with its myriad points of failure and long list of culprits invites a complex and painful reckoning. A simple lie is much cleaner. And so, with a speed and coordination that was tragically absent from their disaster response, the official narrative was forged, hardened, and disseminated to the world. It was a story with a single, magnificent, and unimpeachably blameless villain: the wave. The tsunami was not just a cause, it was elevated into the cause, the sole cause. It was given a name: Sotegai, the unforeseeable, the beyond imagination. This single word became the cornerstone of the entire official story. It was a perfect piece of linguistic engineering, a semantic get-out-of-jail-free card. The earthquake was a prelude. The explosions were a consequence. The meltdowns were an unfortunate result. But the tsunami, this monster from the deep, was the prime mover, the singular, godlike force responsible for everything. It wasn't TEPCO's fault, it wasn't the government's fault, it wasn't the fault of a corrupt and captured regulatory system. It was the planet's fault. This narrative was brutally effective because it contained a kernel of truth. The wave was, of course, monstrous and unprecedented in modern recorded history. But the official story relied on erasing everything that came before it. It required the world to forget about the 869 Jogan tsunami, the ancient geological truth that this coastline was built for such monsters. It required everyone to ignore the most damning piece of evidence of all the smoking gun that we have already discussed. TEPCO, SON 2008 computer simulation that predicted a 15.7-meter wave, the SOTE, the foreseen, that they had deliberately buried. And it required the complete amnesia of the fact that the plant was already critically wounded by the earthquake before the first drop of seawater ever touched its generators. The lie of the Sotegai tsunami was not a lie about the wave's power. It was a lie about its novelty. They portrayed themselves as the victims of a mythological beast that no one could have predicted, when in fact, they had a detailed drawing of the beast in their filing cabinet all along. The construction of this narrative was a deliberate, top-down strategy to whitewash decades of negligence with a single awe-inspiring coat of saltwater. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a senior public relations strategist for the Japanese government, speaking in a closed-door session with cabinet members, April 2011. We cannot survive a narrative of systemic failure. If the public and the world believe this was caused by a made-in-Japan confluence of corporate greed and regulatory incompetence, our entire economic model is finished. We lose everything. But if this was an act of God, a once-in-a-millennium event that overwhelmed an otherwise robust system, then we are not a failed state. We are a tragic but heroic one. The tsunami is our scapegoat. We must focus every statement, every report, every interview on the unprecedented nature of the wave. It is the only villain in this story that cannot be sued, cannot be jailed, and cannot be regulated. The only villain that cannot be sued. This is the cold, brilliant logic of the official story. It transforms a crime scene into a natural history exhibit. The Japanese media, the international press, and even the now compliant IAEA all began to echo this narrative. The disaster was framed as a lesson in disaster preparedness, a wake-up call about the awesome power of nature. It was not framed as a lesson about what happens when a powerful, politically connected industry is allowed to write its own safety rules and ignore its own damning research for decades. The meta-commentary is that this narrative worked. It worked so well that it largely succeeded in deflecting accountability from the individuals and institutions that were truly responsible. By blaming the wave, they turned a story of corporate malfeasance into a story of national tragedy. This allowed the system to survive. No senior TEPCO executives ever went to prison for their role in the disaster. The regulatory bodies were shuffled and renamed, but the fundamental culture of the nuclear village, its insularity and arrogance, remained. The disaster became a catalyst for debates about seawall height, not about the endemic corruption that made the seawall's height irrelevant in the first place. The scapegoat did its job. It absorbed all the blame, all the anger, and all the focus, and then it receded back into the sea, leaving the men who had invited it ashore standing on the beach, unaccountable and still in charge. Once the official narrative had successfully cast the tsunami as the singular, unforeseeable villain, the managers of the nuclear village faced their next, more insidious challenge: the permanent, inconvenient, and profoundly expensive radiological contamination of a huge swath of their own country. The cesium-137, with its 30-year half-life, had settled into the soil, the forests, the rivers, and the water table. It was now part of the landscape. An honest cleanup, a true decontamination effort to return the affected lands to the globally accepted standard of safety, was a physical and financial impossibility. The cost would not be in the billions, but in the trillions. The task would take centuries. The problem wasn't the mess, the problem was the definition of clean. So they decided to change the definition. This is the point where the Fukushima cover-up moves from the operational to the philosophical. It is where they began to rewrite not just the history of the accident, but the very science of safety itself. Before March 2011, the global gold standard for public radiation protection, endorsed by virtually every major regulatory body on the planet, was clear. The maximum acceptable dose for a member of the public, above and beyond natural background radiation, was 1 millisievert per year, 1 msv year. This was the red line. It was the standard upon which evacuation zones and safety protocols were based. And it was a standard that now made a huge portion of Fukushima Prefecture permanently uninhabitable. Faced with this impossible reality, the Japanese government, with the quiet, complicit nod of the international nuclear establishment, performed an act of breathtaking regulatory alchemy. They did not clean the land to meet the standard. They lowered the standard to meet the contaminated land. In the evacuation zones, the official acceptable radiation dose for the public, for children playing in schoolyards, for farmers tilling their fields, for families living in their homes, was raised to 20 millisieverts per year. This was not a minor adjustment. It was a 20-fold increase. It was a number that, before the disaster, was the accepted annual limit for adult classified radiation workers, people who are paid to take on radiological risk and are monitored constantly for health effects. This risk level was now declared safe for the general population. The decision was justified with the cold, pragmatic language of risk management and economic necessity. It was presented as a temporary measure, a practical solution to a difficult problem. But it was, in effect, a massive, state-sanctioned radiological experiment being performed on its own citizenry. Uncomfortable. Quote, from an internal memo circulated within Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, discussing the new 20 MSV year standard. The 1 MSV year recommendation by the ICRP is a peacetime ideological standard, not a practical post-accident recovery metric. Adherence to this standard would result in the permanent abandonment of vast territories, causing catastrophic social dislocation and economic collapse. The public health detriment of such a collapse is arguably greater than the stochastic risk from a moderately elevated radiation dose. We must therefore recalibrate our definition of safety to align with achievable remediation goals and the national imperative to restore normalcy. The 20 MSV year level represents a balance between absolute radiological protection and socio-economic viability. It is not an ideal standard. It is the necessary one. A peacetime ideological standard. Recalibrate our definition of safety, the necessary one. This is the quiet, bureaucratic language of human sacrifice. It is the logic that allows a government to look at a number once deemed unacceptably dangerous and relabel it safe for return. This redefinition was not just a line in a government document. It had profound real-world consequences. It became the legal basis for lifting evacuation orders. It allowed the government to declare towns cleaned and encourage residents to move back into homes where the ambient radiation was still 10 or 15 times higher than the pre-disaster safety limit. It allowed them to slash compensation payments to evacuees, arguing that their hometowns were now officially safe. The meta-commentary is that this act represents the most lasting and global legacy of the Fukushima disaster. It set a terrifying new precedent. It demonstrated that when faced with the astronomical costs of a major nuclear accident, the path of least resistance is not to clean up the mess, but to simply declare the mess to be safe. It has normalized a level of radiological risk that would have been considered an outrage a generation ago. The goalposts of public safety were not just moved, they were ripped out of the ground and hurled miles down the field. And the world's regulators, watching quietly, learned a powerful lesson. If the disaster is big enough, the definition of safe is always negotiable. The recalibration of safety from an absolute standard to a negotiable socio-economic variable was a masterstroke of bureaucratic evil. It allowed the government to declare victory over an invisible enemy simply by changing the rules of engagement. But there was one problem that could not be so easily disappeared. One consequence of the meltdown so vast, so physical, that it could not be hidden with a talking point. It was the water. And it was endless. After the initial, desperate injections of seawater, the battle to cool the 3 molten cores never stopped. Day after day, year after year, hundreds of tons of fresh water are still poured over the corium blobs to prevent them from reheating and releasing even more radiation. This water, upon touching the remains of the cores, becomes intensely, lethally radioactive. But that is only one half of the problem. The Fukushima Daiichi plant was built on a coastal floodplain with a high water table. An ocean of clean groundwater is constantly flowing downhill, seeping into the shattered basements of the reactor buildings, where it, too, makes contact with the molten fuel and becomes just as contaminated. This created a radiological waste stream of horrifying scale. The result is the single most iconic and damning image of the post-disaster landscape: the endless, silent forest of steel tanks, thousands upon thousands of them, marching in neat, grim rows across every square inch of available land, each one holding 1,000 tons of water contaminated with a witch's brew of radioactive isotopes. For years, TEPCO's public posture was that this was a responsible act of containment. "We are storing the water," they said. "We are managing the problem." This, like every other statement they have ever made, was a calculated lie. The tanks were never the solution. They were a stalling tactic. They were a visual holding pen for a problem TEPCO had no intention of ever solving responsibly. The centerpiece of their public relations campaign was a sophisticated filtration system called ALPS, the Advanced Liquid Processing System. TEPCO and the Japanese government have spent a decade telling the world that this system treats the contaminated water, removing the dangerous radioactive elements. They wave charts and graphs showing the successful removal of isotopes like cesium and strontium. And it is true, ALPS is a very effective filter for most of the dangerous materials. But it has one well-known, foundational, and critical flaw. It cannot remove tritium. Tritium is a radioactive isotope of hydrogen. Because it is chemically identical to the hydrogen in the water, H2O itself, no filtration system on Earth can practically remove it on an industrial scale. It becomes part of the water molecule. The only way to get rid of it is to wait for it to decay, which takes decades. TEPCO's long-term plan, the one they formulated in boardrooms years ago while the welders were still sealing the seams on the 1,000th tank, was always brutally simple. The plan was to wait. Wait for the world's attention span to atrophy. Wait for another global crisis, another war, another pandemic, to occupy the headlines. Build the tanks, create the illusion of responsible stewardship, publicize the treatment of the water with ALPS, downplay the significance of the tritium you know you can't remove, and then when the moment is right, declare that you are simply out of space. Present the release of over 1 million tons of tritiated water into the Pacific Ocean, not as a choice, but as a sad, unavoidable technical necessity. Classified memo from TEPCO's Midterm Decommissioning Strategy Group. Subject: Long-Term Contaminated Water Management Pathway. Date: October 2015. The rate of tank construction is unsustainable and presents a significant long-term financial liability. While public and international opposition to oceanic release remains high, This is primarily an emotional and political obstacle, not a scientific one. The recommended pathway is a multi-year normalization strategy. Phase 1. Current. Continue tank construction to demonstrate commitment to on-site storage. Phase 2. Vigorously promote the success of the ALPS filtration, focusing public attention on the removal of strontium and cesium, while framing tritium as a low-risk, naturally occurring substance. Phase 3. Initiate a controlled public relations campaign in coordination with METI and the IAEA to introduce oceanic release as the only viable and scientifically sound final disposition. We will wait for a favorable political window to execute. The goal is to transform the release from an admission of failure into a symbol of a successful, nearly completed cleanup. Transform the release from an admission of failure into a symbol of a successful cleanup. The cynicism is breathtaking. The meta-commentary is this: the impending and now initiated release of the Fukushima water is not the final chapter of a cleanup operation. It is the beginning of a deliberate slow motion and global act of environmental contamination. The initial releases in 2011 were chaotic and accidental. This is methodical and intentional. It is the ultimate externalization of cost. Unable to afford the true price of their failure, they are now dumping their radioactive debt into the Pacific Commons, leaving the fishermen of their own nation, the citizens of neighboring countries, and the entire marine ecosystem to pay the bill. The tanks were never a solution. They were just the loading dock for the next phase of the disaster. The endless forest of water tanks and the redefinition of safety were crucial for managing the present. But the nuclear village needed one final story, a grand, sweeping epic to contain the future. They needed an ending. Every crisis narrative requires a resolution, a projected finish line where normalcy is restored and the credits can roll. And so the official decommissioning plan for Fukushima Daiichi was born. It is, on its face, a model of sober, long-term engineering, a 30 to 40-year roadmap to methodically dismantle the ruined plant, remove the melted fuel, and return the site to a clean, stable state. It is presented in glossy pamphlets and detailed PowerPoint presentations, a testament to Japanese planning and technological resolve. It is also, from beginning to end, a complete and utter work of science fiction. The 40-year timeline is not a scientific projection. It is a political invention. It is not an engineering estimate. It is a public relations necessity. No one has ever decommissioned 3 reactors that have suffered a full meltdown and melt through. The task is so far beyond the scope of current human technology that it borders on the fantastical. The challenges are not merely difficult, they are foundational. First, you cannot remove what you cannot find. A decade after the disaster, TEPCO still does not know the exact location, configuration, or condition of the hundreds of tons of molten corium inside Units 1, 2, and 3. The radiation fields inside the primary containment vessels are so lethally intense, hundreds, even thousands of sieverts per hour, that they destroy any robot sent in to investigate. The machines die in minutes, their electronics fried by the gamma rays. The limited, grainy images they've managed to send back show a hellscape of melted, re-solidified debris, a radioactive slag heap that no human can ever enter, and no machine can yet survive. Planning to remove this fuel in 40 years is like a 16th century cartographer drawing a map to the New World based on a single, blurry glimpse of a coastline through a storm. Second, even if they could find it all, the technology to remove it does not exist. There is no tool on planet Earth that can be sent into a flooded, shattered, lethally radioactive containment vessel to cut up, package, and retrieve hundreds of tons of corium that is harder than concrete and infused with the deadliest elements known to man. Every step of this process, from the remotely operated underwater saws to the shielded casks that will hold the debris, has to be invented from scratch, tested, and perfected. The 40-year plan blithely assumes a series of unprecedented technological breakthroughs will simply arrive on schedule, as if ordering a miracle from a catalog. This is the central, fraudulent premise of the entire plan. It is a schedule without the means of achieving it. It is a promise based on technology that is still theoretical, uncomfortable. Quote, From a confidential assessment by an international nuclear decommissioning consortium, commissioned by a European investment bank in 2018. The 40-year decommissioning schedule for Fukushima Daiichi presented by the Japanese government and TEPCO should be viewed as a statement of political intent, not a technically grounded forecast. Based on our analysis of the known challenges, particularly the fuel debris retrieval, a timeline of 100 to 200 years would be a more realistic and perhaps still optimistic projection. The current 40-year target appears calibrated to the timeframe of government bond issuances and public pension planning cycles, rather than any existing engineering capability. We advise our clients to treat the official completion date as a fiscal placeholder, not a probable outcome. A fiscal placeholder. That is the key. The 40-year number was not chosen by engineers. It was chosen by accountants and politicians. It is a psychologically and financially convenient lie. Psychologically, it places the end of the problem within a single human generation. It creates the comforting illusion that the children of today will see the problem solved in their lifetimes. A 200-year timeline, while more honest, is an admission that the wound is permanent, that the poison will outlast their great-grandchildren. It is a politically unsellable truth. Financially, the 40-year timeline allows for the creation of a manageable budget. The Japanese government can allocate a certain number of yen per year to this multi-trillion yen problem. It creates a predictable line item on the national budget, calming investors and the public by framing an unknowable cost as a knowable one. The meta-commentary is this: the decommissioning plan is the final and perhaps most profound lie of the Fukushima saga. It is a bureaucratic fantasy designed to impose a sense of finite, human-scale order on a problem that is geological in scope and timeless in consequence. They are not decommissioning a power plant. They are attempting to build a sarcophagus around a piece of a dying star that they accidentally created on their own coast. The 40-year plan is the story they are telling themselves and the world so they can sleep at night. A bedtime story for an entire nation that has a monster under its bed. The real timeline is not 40 years. The real timeline is closer to forever. While the fantasy of a 40-year cleanup provided a comforting, abstract story for the future, the human debris of the disaster could not be so easily managed with a PowerPoint presentation. Hundreds of thousands of people, farmers, fishermen, shopkeepers, children, were torn from their homes, their ancestral lands, their entire way of life. They became the Hinanmin, the evacuees, the living, breathing embodiment of the nuclear village's failure. And just as the state had managed the meltdown, the media, and the science of safety, it now set about managing them. The systems of compensation and care that were established were not instruments of compassion. They were instruments of containment, meticulously designed to minimize cost, limit liability, and ultimately, to erase the victims from the national balance sheet. The first front in this war of attrition was compensation. On the surface, it seemed just. TEPCO, under government pressure, would compensate the displaced for their losses. But the reality was a bureaucratic labyrinth, a psychological gauntlet designed to exhaust and demoralize. Evacuees were handed phone book-thick stacks of forms, demanding they itemize and prove the value of every single possession lost in a home they could never return to. They had to become forensic accountants of their own shattered lives. How do you put a price on an ancestral farm, on a community, on the view from your window? The burden of proof was placed entirely on the victim. Every claim was scrutinized, questioned, and, more often than not, reduced by an anonymous panel of adjusters working for the very company that had poisoned them. Worse, the government created a cruel caste system of victimhood. It drew lines on a map, distinguishing between forced evacuation zones and areas where people fled out of a voluntary fear for their family's health. Those who were officially ordered out received a base level of support. Those who fled from just outside the arbitrary lines, often from areas that the hidden speedy maps showed were even more contaminated, received little or nothing. It was a deliberate strategy to fracture the victim community, pitting desperate groups against each other and dissolving any sense of collective injustice. The second, and more sinister front, was health monitoring. The government knew that the greatest long-tail liability from a nuclear disaster is not property. It is cancer. It is a lifetime of chronic illness, an honest, robust, and proactive health monitoring program designed to find and treat radiation-induced illnesses would be a tacit admission of guilt, an open-ended financial commitment that would last for generations. So they designed a system to do the opposite. The official Fukushima Health Management Survey was not a tool for compassionate care. It was a tool for generating data to prove that no one was getting sick from radiation. The government's official, unwavering position from day one has been that, aside from the initial industrial accidents, no deaths or illnesses can be definitively linked to radiation from the Fukushima disaster. When an unprecedented cluster of thyroid cancers, over 200 cases, was discovered among the children of Fukushima, a rate dozens of times higher than normal, the official explanation was not that it was caused by the well-known release of radioactive iodine. Instead, the government and its hand-picked academic experts claimed it was the result of a screening effect, that by testing so many children, they were simply finding benign cancers that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. It was an explanation of breathtaking audacity. They were not treating the victims of an epidemic. They were blaming the victims for being overdiagnosed. Classified memo from the Japanese Ministry of Finance to the Reconstruction Agency. Subject: long-term fiscal sustainability of Fukushima compensation and health programs. Date: circa 2014. The current open-ended structure of evacuee compensation and health subsidies presents an unsustainable long-term fiscal liability. It also creates a moral hazard, discouraging evacuees from achieving self-sufficiency. We recommend a strategic shift from direct individual compensation to community-based revitalization grants. Furthermore, the health program must maintain its focus as a data collection and research endeavor. Any official linkage of specific illnesses, e.g., thyroid cancers, to the accident would open the state to limitless legal and financial exposure. The official position must remain that observed health effects are statistically insignificant or attributable to other factors such as lifestyle or the psychological stress of the evacuation itself. Our goal is to cap and eventually sunset these direct liabilities within the next decade. Moral hazard: psychological stress of the evacuation itself. Sunset these direct liabilities. This is the cold language of abandonment. The evacuees are not citizens to be cared for. They are a line item on a budget, a liability to be extinguished. The meta-commentary is this: the systematic abandonment of the evacuees is the final, most personal act of the cover-up. First, they denied the meltdown. Then, they hid the plume. Then, they rewrote the definition of safe. And now, they are trying to erase the last living proof of their crime: the victims themselves. By denying their illnesses, by strangling their compensation, and by constantly pressuring them to return to homes that are still contaminated under any sane pre-2011 standard, they are trying to close the book. The evacuees are the last inconvenient truth, and the system is designed to make them go away, either by forcing them home or by waiting for them to die. The systematic effort to make the human cost of Fukushima disappear from the national ledger stands in grotesque contrast to the monumental effort made to save the life of the perpetrator. As the evacuees were being buried under mountains of paperwork and gaslit over their own illnesses, a very different kind of rescue operation was underway in the halls of power in Tokyo, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, the corporate entity directly and unequivocally responsible for the worst nuclear disaster of the 21st century, the company whose decades of negligence, lies, and hubris had laid the groundwork for the apocalypse was about to receive its reward. In any rational system of justice or capitalism, TEPCO should have ceased to exist. A company that self-immolates its own most valuable assets and incurs liabilities estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars is, by definition, insolvent. It should have been driven into bankruptcy, its assets liquidated, its leadership disgraced and prosecuted, its very name a permanent synonym for corporate failure. But TEPCO was not a normal company. It was a central pillar of the nuclear village. It was more than too big to fail. It was too politically interconnected to be held accountable. Its death would not just be a corporate bankruptcy. It would be the collapse of the entire corrupt, self-sustaining ecosystem of ministries, contractors and politicians that had fed off the Anzan Shinwa for half a century. And so, the system moved to save itself. The mechanism was a masterpiece of financial alchemy, a bailout disguised as a nationalization. The government created a new entity, the Nuclear Damage Compensation and Decommissioning Facilitation Corporation, NDF. This state-backed fund began injecting colossal sums of public money, taxpayer money, directly into TEPCO. In exchange for this lifeline, the government became the majority shareholder. On paper, this looked like a punishment, a state takeover. In reality, it was a rescue of unprecedented scale. It was not a hostile takeover designed to clean house. It was a friendly merger designed to preserve the institution. The company was saved from its creditors. It was shielded from the consequences of its own actions. And most critically, its core operational structure was left largely intact. The ghost of the old TEPCO was not exorcised. It was given a government-funded pension. The company that had lied to the Prime Minister, hidden the speedy maps, and valued its balance sheet over the lives of its citizens, was now, officially, a ward of the state. And what was its new primary mission? What was the grand project for which it was being kept alive with an IV drip of public cash? It was to oversee the multi-trillion yen, multi-decade decommissioning of Fukushima Daiichi. Classified memo, from a Vice Minister of Finance to the Cabinet's Economic Council. Subject, the non-viability of TEPCO liquidation. Date, late 2011. While the political appeal of dismantling TEPCO is undeniable, the economic and systemic consequences are unacceptable. A forced bankruptcy would trigger a catastrophic default in the corporate bond market, destabilize Japan's entire financial system, and jeopardize the stability of the national energy grid. It is more prudent to convert TEPCO's liability into a state-managed asset. Through the NDF, we can socialize the costs of the accident across the tax base and future electricity rates over a period of decades. This preserves market stability. Furthermore, TEPCO, despite its failures, retains the institutional knowledge and personnel necessary to manage the decommissioning. Dismantling the company would force us to rebuild that expertise from scratch at a much higher cost. The goal is not punitive justice, it is the pragmatic management of a national financial and engineering crisis. We must save the patient, however flawed, because we cannot afford the cost of the autopsy. The goal is not punitive justice. We must save the patient, however flawed. This is the cold, amoral calculus of a system protecting its own. They saw a criminal enterprise and decided it was more efficient to deputize it than to jail it. The meta-commentary is perhaps the most damning indictment of all. By saving TEPCO, the government created the single greatest conflict of interest in the history of industrial cleanup. The company that has a direct financial incentive to cut corners, to hide mistakes, and to prolong the most expensive construction project in human history is the very same company that is in charge of it. The fox was not just put in charge of guarding the henhouse. The government nationalized the fox, gave it a lifetime contract, and put it on the public payroll to oversee the reconstruction of the henhouse it had just burned to the ground. This single decision guaranteed that the culture of secrecy, the prioritization of cost over safety, and the institutional arrogance that caused the disaster would be baked into the very DNA of the cleanup. The bailout didn't just save a company, it preserved a disease. And so we arrive at the final, most bitter truth, the capstone on this monument to human failure. The bailout of TEPCO was not an isolated act of financial desperation. It was a symptom of the true disease. It was the immune system of the nuclear village kicking in to save not just one of its limbs, but its very heart. For a brief, fleeting moment in the spring of 2011, the disaster had ripped the curtain away. The world, and the Japanese people, had a clear view of the corrupt, self-serving, and catastrophically incompetent network of power that had led them to the brink. They saw the captured regulators, the complicit academics, the arrogant industrialists, and the willfully blind politicians. There was a moment of pure, incandescent rage, a moment where a true reckoning seemed not only possible but inevitable. And then, the moment passed. The system, with the practiced ease of a century of bureaucratic self-preservation, simply closed ranks, weathered the storm of public anger, and carried on. The story of post-Fukushima accountability is a story of nothing. It is a deafening silence where a roar of justice should be. The few senior TEPCO executives who were forced to stand trial for professional negligence were, after years of legal maneuvering, acquitted. The courts ruled that the tsunami was, officially, sotegai, unforeseeable, thus absolving them of criminal responsibility. Remember TEPCO's own 2008 report predicting that very tsunami? It was deemed insufficient evidence of foresight. The official narrative, the one forged to contain history, had become a legally binding reality. The lie had become the law. The bureaucrats at NISA and MITI, the regulators who had rubber-stamped TEPCO's flawed safety cases for decades, were not prosecuted. They were not even disgraced. Many were simply shuffled into different departments. Others took advantage of the classic Japanese system of amakudari, descent from heaven, where senior civil servants retire into lucrative executive positions in the very industries they were once supposed to regulate. The watchdogs were rewarded with cushy kennels. The academics who had spent their careers publishing papers that validated the Anzan Shinwa were not ostracized. They are now the very same experts sitting on the government panels overseeing the cleanup and advising on the safety of restarting Japan's other reactors. The village did not just survive the earthquake, it has consolidated its power. This is the ultimate triumph of the system. It has proven itself to be more resilient than a magnitude 9.1 earthquake. It is more durable than a 15-meter tsunami. It is more robust than 3 melted-through reactor cores. Its instinct for self-preservation is the most powerful force in the nation. It has absorbed the greatest industrial catastrophe in modern history and treated it not as a mortal wound, but as a learning opportunity. A lesson not in safety but in how to better manage the political and public relations fallout the next time. Uncomfortable. Quote from a retired senior METI bureaucrat in a private conversation with a political scientist in 2019. People wanted scapegoats. It's understandable. But to dismantle the village, you don't understand what you would be asking for. You would be asking to dismantle Japan's entire post-war industrial strategy. This network, TEPCO, Hitachi, the ministries, the universities, it didn't just build nuclear plants. It built the bullet trains. It built the economic miracle. You cannot surgically remove the bad parts without killing the entire organism. The survival of the system, even in a damaged state, was deemed a greater national priority than the punishment of a few of its managers. Fukushima was the price of stability. It was a terrible price, but the alternative, in our view, was chaos. Fukushima was the price of stability. In that single chilling sentence lies the entire ethos of the unbroken, unrepentant nuclear village. The sacrifice of the people of Fukushima, the contamination of their land, the endless trauma of the evacuees. It was all a regrettable but necessary cost of doing business, a rounding error in the grand calculation of maintaining the national order. The final, devastating meta-commentary is this. The true fallout from Fukushima is not the cesium-137 that will poison the soil for the next 300 years. It is the chilling realization that in a sufficiently complex and powerful technocratic state, accountability is a myth. The system that created the disaster has now been entrusted with cleaning it up, defining its consequences, writing its history, and, most terrifyingly of all, presiding over the future of the technology. The ghost of TEPCO, saved by the state, still walks the halls of power. The meltdowns at Fukushima Daiichi have been contained, after a fashion. But the institutional meltdown, the failure of ethics, transparency, and responsibility that made it all possible, remains gloriously, terrifyingly, and permanently uncontained. The final outcome of the Fukushima Daiichi disaster remains a study in ambiguity. On one hand, 3 reactor cores lie entombed in their shattered buildings, a permanent radiological wound on the Japanese coast, a cleanup effort stretching into a future no one can truly imagine. The cost, measured in trillions of yen and the shattered lives of hundreds of thousands of evacuees, is incalculable, but the cost of secrecy is just as profound. We've synthesized the details in this dossier to reveal the true paradoxes, but the history is real. The deliberate lies about the meltdowns, the burial of the speedy data, the redefinition of safe radiation levels. These weren't just poor decisions. They were acts that eroded the very concept of public trust. The official narratives offered by governments and corporations are rarely, if ever, the complete story. The true history is almost always buried in the uncomfortable details they choose to omit. We encourage you to share your own research and thoughts on the details we've uncovered. What have we missed? What truths are still buried, and that's the truth they tried to bury? Until next time, always question the official story.